From the sad tale of Charles II's famous Habsburg jaw to the quiet DNA tests now happening behind modern palace doors, this is a calm yet gripping journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with why Queen Joanna of Castile's cousin marriage left Spain fearing Joanna the Mad, and move deeper into how today's kings and queens turn to genetic doctors to escape the same fate. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. The Habsburg seed, Joanna, Philip. In the autumn mists of 1496, 2 young cousins stood before the altar in Leer, a modest Flemish town that would witness one of history's most consequential marriages. Joanna of Castile, barely 17, with dark eyes that seemed to hold storms, gazed upon Philip the handsome of Burgundy, whose golden hair caught the candlelight like spun silk. They were beautiful, these two with the classical features that earned him his epithet, she with the intense beauty of the Trastamara line. What the assembled nobles could not see, what the Archbishop blessing their union could not divine, was that this marriage would plant seeds of genetic catastrophe that would bloom across centuries. The political architects of this union, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile on one side, Maximilian I of Austria on the other, had crafted what they believed to be a masterstroke. By binding the Spanish kingdoms to the Austrian territories through marriage, they were creating a power block that would dominate Europe. But in their calculations of crowns and territories, they had overlooked a more intimate arithmetic. Joanna and Philip shared great-grandparents. Their children would carry the concentrated essence of both Spanish and Austrian royal bloodlines, a genetic distillation that would prove both blessing and curse. Joanna's lineage traced back through generations of careful royal marriages, each union designed to strengthen political alliances while keeping noble blood pure. Her great-grandmother on her mother's side was Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt, while her great-great-grandmother, Catherine of Lancaster, had married into the Castilian royal house. The threads of kinship wove through noble houses like silver wire through a tapestry, creating patterns of relationship that grew ever more complex and concentrated. Philip's ancestry followed similar pathways through the Austrian and Burgundian courts. His great-grandfather was Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor, whose own marriage had been carefully arranged to consolidate Habsburg power. The Burgundian dukes had long practiced strategic intermarriage, keeping their wealthy territories under family control. When Philip's father, Maximilian, married Mary of Burgundy, he was continuing this tradition of marrying within the extended network of related nobility. The wedding feast stretched into the night, with musicians playing soft melodies that drifted through halls hung with tapestries depicting scenes of courtly love. Wine flowed from silver goblets, and the young couple danced with the grace expected of their station. Yet already there were whispers among the courtiers not about politics or territory, but about Joanna herself. Some said she possessed an intensity that bordered on the unsettling, a passionate nature that seemed to burn too brightly. These early observations would prove prophetic. Within months of their marriage, Joanna was pregnant with their first child, Eleanor. The pregnancy proceeded normally, but those close to the young mother noted her extreme emotional attachment to her husband. When Philip travelled to conduct business in his Burgundian territories, Joanna would fall into periods of melancholy so profound that her attendants grew concerned. She would stare from castle windows for hours, her hands pressed against the glass, waiting for the distant dust clouds that might herald his return. Their second child, Charles, born in 1500, would inherit not just crowns but the concentrated genetic legacy of his parents' shared ancestry. In the child's features, courtiers could see both Spanish intensity and Austrian gravitas, but they could not see the recessive traits beginning to accumulate in his bloodline. The boy seemed healthy enough, robust, intelligent, with the Habsburg jaw just beginning to manifest in his developing features. As their family grew to include Isabella, Ferdinand, Mary, and Catherine, Joanna's behavior became increasingly erratic. Philip's frequent absences triggered episodes of rage and despair that echoed through the castle corridors. She would sometimes refuse food for days, or fly into jealous rages when she suspected, often correctly, that Philip was conducting affairs during his travels. The court physicians, limited by the medical understanding of their time, could only observe and whisper about the Queen's melancholic humours. The tragedy deepened when Philip died suddenly in 1506, possibly from typhoid fever, leaving Joanna a widow at 27. Her grief transcended normal mourning and descended into what can only be described as obsession. She refused to allow his burial, insisting on travelling with his coffin across the Spanish countryside, stopping only at convents and monasteries where women could not corrupt her husband's remains. For 3 years, she wandered with her macabre entourage, earning the epithet Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Her father Ferdinand, recognizing her incapacity to rule, declared her unfit and assumed regency of Castile. Joanna was confined to the castle of Tordesillas, where she would spend the remaining 46 years of her life in what amounted to gilded imprisonment. There, in chambers hung with black tapestries, she continued to speak to Philip as if he was still alive, setting places for him at meals and waiting for his return. But the damage was already done. Through their 6 children, Joanna and Philip had seeded the royal houses of Europe with their concentrated bloodline. Their son Charles would become the most powerful man in Europe, ruling Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and vast American territories. Yet he would also carry forward the genetic burden of his parents' consanguineous union, passing it to his own children and establishing a pattern of close-kin marriage that would define Habsburg practice for centuries to come. In the quiet halls of Tordesillas, as Joanna aged into madness, the future was already written in the genetic code of her descendants. The seeds planted by this marriage of beautiful cousins would grow into a genealogical garden where the same bloodlines would be crossed and recrossed, concentrated and refined, until the very traits that had made their family powerful would become the instruments of their downfall. Crown of crossed bloodlines, Charles II of Spain. The last Habsburg king of Spain was born dying. When Charles II drew his first breath in the ornate chambers of the Royal Alcázar of Madrid on November 6, 1661, the very act seemed to exhaust him. The infant prince, heir to the greatest empire the world had ever known, entered life with a constellation of defects that would define both his tragic existence and the genetic catastrophe that was Spanish Habsburg inbreeding. To understand Charles II, one must first comprehend the mathematical impossibility of his bloodline. Where a healthy family tree branches outward through generations, creating genetic diversity with each new marriage, the Spanish Habsburg genealogy formed an almost circular pattern. Charles's 8 great-grandparents, who should have been 8 different people contributing varied genetic material, were instead just 4 individuals appearing multiple times in his lineage. His great-great-great-grandmother Joanna of Castile appeared in his family tree an astounding 14 times. The concentration reached its apex in Charles's parents. His father, Philip IV, and his mother, Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Philip was the brother of Mariana's father, Ferdinand III. But their relationship was even more intertwined than this simple description suggests. Through the tangled web of Habsburg marriages stretching back generations, they were also first cousins through multiple pathways. Genetic calculations performed by modern scientists have determined that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254 higher than that of children born to siblings. From birth, Charles exhibited the accumulated effects of 2 centuries of consanguineous marriages. His most prominent feature was the dramatically protruding Habsburg jaw, technically known as mandibular prognathism, which had become so exaggerated through selective breeding that his lower teeth extended far beyond his upper ones. This deformity made eating a laborious process. Courtiers reported that Charles could barely chew food, instead swallowing most of it whole, leading to chronic digestive problems that would plague him throughout his life. The infant prince's physical development proceeded with agonizing slowness. While other royal children of his era were walking by their first birthday, Charles remained unable to stand unsupported until he was 4 years old. His legs, weak and unstable, seemed barely capable of supporting his body. Court physicians, limited by 17th-century medical understanding, attributed his delays to an excess of phlegmatic humours, but modern analysis suggests he suffered from a combination of conditions including rickets, hormonal imbalances, and possible genetic disorders affecting muscle tone and bone development. Speech came even later than mobility. Charles's grotesquely enlarged tongue, another manifestation of his genetic inheritance, combined with his severe jaw malformation to make articulation nearly impossible. When he finally began to speak, his words emerged as thick, mumbled utterances that required courtiers to lean close to understand. Foreign ambassadors reported difficulty conducting audiences with the king, as they often needed interpreters not for language but simply to decipher his speech. The Spanish court adapted itself around their defective monarch with the elaborate etiquette that characterized Habsburg rule. Every meal became a carefully choreographed performance, with specially trained servants cutting Charles's food into tiny pieces and patient attendants allowing extra time for the laborious process of eating. Court painters, masters of diplomatic artistry, learned to position Charles in ways that minimized his deformities, often showing him in profile to disguise the severity of his prognathic jaw, or depicting him seated to hide his stunted stature and weak legs. As Charles matured, if his arrested development could be called maturation, his mental capacity became increasingly evident. He possessed a childlike simplicity that courtiers described diplomatically as innocence, but which foreign observers characterized more bluntly as intellectual disability. He delighted in simple games and showed particular fascination with clockwork mechanisms, spending hours watching mechanical toys perform their repetitive motions. His attention span remained that of a child well into his adult years, and he required constant supervision to manage even basic royal duties. The question of Charles's marriage became an international preoccupation, not from any hope of his happiness, but because the succession of the Spanish Empire hung in the balance. His first marriage, to Marie-Louise d'Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France, was arranged when Charles was 18. The young French princess, vivacious and healthy, found herself bound to a man who could barely speak coherently and whose physical presence reportedly made her weep. Court records, tactfully worded but clear in their implications, indicate that Charles was likely incapable of consummating the marriage. Marie-Louise's sudden death in 1689, at age 27, sparked rumors of poison, though modern historians suggest her death resulted from complications of a riding accident. What seems certain is that her decade of marriage to Charles produced no children. Despite the desperate hopes of Spanish courtiers and the ministrations of physicians who prescribed increasingly bizarre treatments to enhance the king's fertility, Charles's second marriage, to Maria Anna of Neuburg, sister of the Holy Roman Emperor, proved equally fruitless. Maria Anna, a robust German princess, approached her marital duties with Germanic determination, but even her efforts could not overcome the fundamental biological impossibility of her husband's fertility. Court physicians documented Charles's physical underdevelopment in clinical terms that, while delicately phrased, clearly indicated severe hormonal deficiencies that made conception impossible. Throughout European chancelleries, diplomats placed bets on Charles's longevity and speculated about the Spanish succession. His cousin Leopold I in Vienna harbored hopes that his son, the Archduke Charles, might inherit the Spanish territories. In Versailles, Louis XIV calculated how his grandson Philip might claim the Spanish throne through his descent from Philip IV. The dying king became a chess piece in the great game of European politics, his every illness monitored by foreign spies and his childlessness celebrated or mourned according to each nation's interests. Charles's physical decline accelerated in his 30s. He suffered from chronic diarrhea, frequent vomiting, and episodes of what court physicians described as melancholic madness. His hair began falling out in patches, his teeth, what remained of them, loosened and fell from his diseased gums, and his already pale complexion took on the waxy pallor of chronic illness. He moved through the vast chambers of the Alcazar like a ghost, attended by servants who spoke in whispers and courtiers who crossed themselves when they thought he wasn't looking. The Spanish people, who rarely saw their king due to his reclusiveness, nonetheless felt the weight of his genetic burden upon their empire. Spain's military defeats, mounted as resources, were diverted to medical treatments and court physicians. The once mighty Spanish navy found itself outmaneuvered by English and Dutch fleets, while Spanish territories in Italy fell to French armies. It was as if the genetic decline of the monarchy had infected the very sinews of the state. As Charles II approached 40, foreign ambassadors reported that he appeared closer to 70, his body ravaged by the accumulated genetic damage of generations of inbreeding. He would die childless in 1700, ending the Spanish Habsburg line and triggering the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape European balance of power. His death certificate, preserved in Spanish archives, listed no specific cause, but modern historians understand that Charles II died from the simple impossibility of his existence, a genetic experiment that had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Double Habsburg vows Leopold I, Maria Anna. In the summer of 1666, the imperial court at Vienna witnessed a wedding that would have seemed shocking in any other dynasty, but had become almost routine among the Habsburgs. Emperor Leopold I, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, stood before the altar of St. Stephen's Cathedral to marry his niece, Maria Anna of Austria. She was the daughter of his brother Philip IV of Spain, making their union not merely a political alliance, but a deliberate concentration of Habsburg bloodlines that exemplified the family's obsession with keeping power within their own veins. Leopold himself embodied the physical consequences of such concentrated breeding, standing barely 5 feet tall, with the characteristic Habsburg jaw so pronounced that his lower lip protruded grotesquely beyond his upper. He possessed a frame so delicate that courtiers worried about his ability to survive the physical demands of kingship. His enormous nose, another Habsburg trademark that had grown more prominent with each generation of inbreeding, dominated his narrow face like a mountain peak. Yet despite his physical frailties, Leopold possessed an intellect sharpened by the finest tutors of his age and a musical talent that found expression in compositions still performed today. Maria Anna, at 26, brought her own catalogue of Habsburg characteristics to the marriage. She was pale to the point of translucency, her skin so thin that courtiers could see the blue tracery of veins beneath its surface. Like her uncle husband, she suffered from chronic digestive ailments that made eating a careful negotiation between sustenance and suffering. Her Habsburg jaw, while less pronounced than Leopold's, still affected her speech, giving her words a distinctive lisp that foreign ambassadors found difficult to understand during formal audiences. The marriage represented more than romantic union. It was a calculated attempt to consolidate the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg territories under a single genetic heritage. By marrying his niece, Leopold ensured that their children would be 3/4 Habsburg, carrying the concentrated essence of the family's bloodline. This mathematical precision in breeding might have impressed livestock farmers, but its application to human reproduction would prove catastrophic. Court physicians at the Hofburg documented the couple's early married life with the clinical detachment required of their positions. Private medical records, preserved in the imperial archives, reveal the intimate struggles of this imperial pair. Leopold suffered from what court doctors diplomatically termed weakness of constitution, requiring special diets and frequent rest periods. His physicians prescribed wine mixed with powdered pearls and gold leaf, believing these precious substances might strengthen his delicate system. Maria Anna's medical challenges proved even more complex. Court gynecologists, working within the limited understanding of 17th-century medicine, noted her irregular cycles and frequent episodes of what they called hysteric passion. Modern medical historians suggest she likely suffered from hormonal imbalances common among children of consanguineous marriages. Her physicians treated her with bloodletting, purgatives, and prayers interventions that likely worsened her condition while providing little relief. The imperial couple's attempts to produce an heir became a matter of state urgency observed by foreign diplomats and chronicled by court scribes. Each of Maria Anna's pregnancies was announced with imperial fanfare, complete with Te Deums sung in cathedrals across the empire and special prayers offered for the health of the expected child. But these celebrations repeatedly turned to mourning as pregnancy after pregnancy ended in miscarriage or infant death. Court records, written in the careful Latin that allowed physicians to discuss intimate matters while maintaining appropriate distance, document a heartbreaking series of losses. Maria Anna's first pregnancy, announced with great joy in 1667, ended in miscarriage during the 4th month. The court physicians attributed the loss to an excess of melancholic humors, but modern analysis suggests the genetic incompatibilities of the parents made successful reproduction extremely difficult. Their second attempt at parenthood followed a similar tragic pattern. Maria Anna carried this pregnancy further, reaching the 7th month before delivering a son who lived only hours. The infant, according to court records, exhibited grievous malformations that made survival impossible. Imperial protocol required that even these failed heirs receive full royal burial rites, creating the macabre spectacle of funeral processions for children who barely had the chance to draw breath. The emotional toll of these repeated losses manifested differently in each spouse. Leopold threw himself into his musical compositions, creating pieces of heartbreaking beauty that seemed to channel his private grief into public art. His cantatas from this period, with their themes of loss and divine providence, spoke to sorrows too deep for words. He would spend hours at the harpsichord, his delicate fingers drawing melancholy melodies from the keys, while tears traced paths down his prominent cheekbones. Maria Anna's response was more internalized, expressing itself through increased religious devotion that bordered on obsession. She commissioned private chapels within the Hofburg, spending hours in prayer before reliquaries containing fragments of saints' bones. Her correspondence with Confessor reveals a woman tormented by the belief that her reproductive failures represented divine punishment for some unknown sin. She undertook pilgrimages to sacred sites across Austria, traveling in specially cushioned carriages, designed to minimize the jolting that might disturb another pregnancy. Vienna's court society adapted itself around the imperial couple's private tragedies with the elaborate etiquette that characterized Habsburg rule. Courtiers learned to avoid any mention of children in their presence, while court painters received instructions to exclude depictions of imperial offspring from official portraits. The absence of Habsburg heirs became a palpable presence in the Hofburg, felt in the empty nurseries that remained perpetually prepared yet never occupied. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their home courts about the imperial couple's struggles, often with barely concealed satisfaction from representatives of rival powers. The French ambassador's dispatches to Versailles contained detailed speculations about Habsburg fertility problems, while English diplomats calculated how Leopold's childlessness might affect the European balance of power. The most intimate struggles of the imperial couple became matters of international strategic importance. Medical treatments grew increasingly desperate as physicians exhausted conventional remedies. Maria Anna endured procedures that modern medicine recognizes as both useless and dangerous: applications of heated stones to her abdomen, consumption of powdered unicorn horn mixed with holy water, and bloodletting timed to coincide with favorable astrological configurations. Leopold submitted to equally bizarre treatments designed to enhance his virility, including baths in wine infused with exotic herbs and the wearing of amulets blessed by various saints. The couple's few successful pregnancies only deepened their tragedy. When Maria Anna finally carried a child to term in 1672, the birth of their daughter Maria Antonia brought brief joy to the imperial court. But the child, while surviving infancy, exhibited the accumulated effects of Habsburg inbreeding in her frail constitution and developmental delays. She would live only 4 years, her death in 1676, marking the end of Leopold and Maria Anna's hopes for continuing their genetic line. Maria Anna's own death in 1676, at age 36, freed Leopold to seek new alliances through marriage, but her passing represented more than personal loss. It marked the failure of yet another attempt to concentrate Habsburg genetics through close-kin marriage. Her funeral procession through Vienna's streets drew enormous crowds, but observers noted that the people mourned not just an empress, but the end of a genetic experiment that had consumed 2 lives in its doomed pursuit of dynastic purity. The Ptolemaic paradigm, Cleopatra II, Ptolemy VIII, 3 centuries before Christ walked the dusty roads of Palestine. Another dynasty had already perfected the art of keeping power within the family through means that would shock even the scandal-hardened courts of later European royalty. In the sun-baked splendor of Ptolemaic Egypt, where the Nile's flood cycles determined the rhythm of civilization, brother-sister marriage was not merely accepted but considered a divine necessity, a sacred imitation of the gods themselves that would preserve both bloodline purity and territorial integrity for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemaic approach to incest was both more systematic and more extreme than anything the Habsburgs would later attempt. Where European royal houses occasionally married cousins or uncles to nieces, the Ptolemies made sibling marriage their primary strategy, creating a genetic bottleneck so severe that some Ptolemaic rulers were simultaneously uncle, nephew, brother, and cousin to their own children. This wasn't the product of accidental policy drift or gradual cultural acceptance. It was deliberate, calculated, and religiously sanctified. Cleopatra II, born around 185 BCE, embodied both the benefits and the curses of this concentrated breeding program. Contemporary accounts describe her as possessing the classical beauty associated with her dynasty, sharp, intelligent features that grace Ptolemaic coins and sculptures, combined with the regal bearing that comes from centuries of unquestioned authority. Yet she also carried the subtle signs of genetic stress that plagued her lineage, a tendency toward emotional volatility, episodes of illness that court physicians couldn't explain, and the distinctive family trait of unusually pale skin that required careful protection from Egypt's blazing sun. Her brother and husband, Ptolemy VIII, known as Physcon the Bloated, presented a stark contrast to the idealized royal image. By middle age, he had grown enormously fat, his body swelling with a kind of obesity that suggests metabolic dysfunction rather than mere overindulgence. His nickname, whispered first by Alexandrian courtiers and eventually adopted throughout the Mediterranean world, referred not just to his physical appearance, but to his insatiable appetites for food, luxury, and violence. Yet despite his repulsive appearance and cruel temperament, Cleopatra II would remain bound to him through marriage, divorce, civil war, and remarriage, a cycle of attraction and repulsion that characterized many Ptolemaic relationships. The marriage of Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII represented more than personal union. It was the continuation of a theological imperative that had governed Egyptian royal practice since the time of the pharaohs. The Ptolemies, as Macedonian Greeks ruling over an Egyptian population, had adopted and amplified the native tradition of divine kingship. Just as the gods, Isis and Osiris, were both siblings and spouses, so too must earthly pharaohs mirror this celestial pattern. Brother-sister marriage was not merely permitted but required, a sacred duty that placed royal bloodlines above the moral constraints governing ordinary mortals. Alexandria, the glittering capital where this divine drama unfolded, represented the height of Hellenistic civilization. Its famous lighthouse guided ships from across the Mediterranean, while its legendary library housed the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. In the royal quarter, behind walls of imported marble and beneath painted ceilings that depicted the celestial marriages of the gods, Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII conducted their tempestuous relationship against a backdrop of unprecedented luxury and learning. Their marriage, celebrated with festivals that lasted for months and cost sums that would bankrupt smaller kingdoms, initially appeared successful by Ptolemaic standards. Cleopatra II bore several children who survived infanzino, small achievement in an era when royal infant mortality often exceeded 50%. But the genetic consequences of their union became apparent as these children matured. Sons showed the characteristic Ptolemaic tendency toward mental instability, while daughters exhibited the pale, fragile beauty that graced royal women but left them vulnerable to diseases that more genetically diverse populations might resist. The couple's relationship deteriorated as Ptolemy VIII's appetites grew more extreme and his paranoia more pronounced. He began to suspect his wife of plotting against him, not an unreasonable fear in a dynasty where murder was a standard tool of succession planning. Cleopatra II, for her part, found her brother-husband's behavior increasingly intolerable, particularly his habit of ordering executions during dinner parties and his growing obsession with young boys from the gymnasium. Their first divorce, in 142 BCE, scandalized even the cynical population of Alexandria. Cleopatra II fled to Cyprus, taking the royal treasury and several of their children, while Ptolemy VIII declared their marriage invalid and married their younger sister, Cleopatra III. This created the bizarre situation of a man simultaneously being uncle, brother-in-law, and former husband to his new wife, while his ex-wife was simultaneously sister, aunt, and rival claimant to the throne. But Ptolemaic genetics produced more than physical abnormalities. It also created psychological instabilities that made sustained conflict almost inevitable. The civil war that followed their divorce consumed Egypt for over a decade, with brother fighting sister, uncle battling niece, and cousin slaughtering cousin in a carnival of familial violence that left Alexandria's streets running with royal blood. Ptolemy VIII's forces controlled the capital, while Cleopatra II held the upper regions of the Nile, each claiming legitimacy through their shared but now poisoned bloodline. The war's most horrific moment came when Ptolemy VIII murdered Cleopatra II's teenage son, his own nephew and stepson, during a royal banquet, then sent the dismembered body to his estranged sister as a birthday gift. This act of calculated cruelty, shocking even by Ptolemaic standards, demonstrated how the dynasty's genetic concentration had produced not just physical deformities, but a capacity for violence that transcended normal human behavior. Yet even this atrocity could not permanently sever the family bonds that held the Ptolemaic system together. In 124 BCE, after 15 years of warfare that had devastated Egypt and enriched their Roman observers, Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII negotiated a reconciliation that required them to remarry. The ceremony, conducted with appropriate solemnity despite its grotesque implications, reunited not just husband and wife but brother and sister, uncle and niece, and former enemies who had spent years trying to kill each other. Their second marriage proved surprisingly stable, perhaps because both siblings had exhausted their capacity for surprise. They ruled jointly for the remaining 6 years of Ptolemy VIII's life, sharing power and even producing additional children despite their advanced age and traumatic history. Court observers noted that their relationship had acquired a strange tenderness, as if shared cruelty had created a bond deeper than mere affection. When Ptolemy VIII died in 116 BCE, his enormously bloated body requiring a specially constructed sarcophagus, Cleopatra II found herself once again sharing power with a sibling, this time her sister-wife Cleopatra III, in a triumvirate that included yet another Ptolemy as nominal male ruler. The three-way marriage that had briefly existed was now replaced by a three-way rule that demonstrated the Ptolemaic genius for turning biological impossibility into political advantage. The reign of Cleopatra II established patterns that would govern Ptolemaic politics for the remaining century of their rule. Brothers would marry sisters, uncles would wed nieces, and civil wars would alternate, with reconciliations in an endless cycle of genetic concentration and political fragmentation. Each generation would be more inbred than the last, their gene pools shrinking even as their claims to divinity grew more elaborate and their capacity for violence more refined. Tutankhamun, pharaoh of fragile bones. In the sun-scorched valley where the ancient Egyptians buried their god-kings, the most famous tomb of all held the mummy of a teenager whose very existence testified to the catastrophic effects of royal inbreeding. Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh, whose golden death mask has gazed out from museum displays and textbook covers for nearly a century, was not merely a symbol of ancient Egyptian splendor, but a victim of genetic experimentation that had been conducted in the name of divine kingship for over a millennium. When Howard Carter first peered into Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, his candle flickering in the stale air of the burial chamber, he saw wonderful things, golden chariots, jeweled daggers, and treasures beyond imagination. But modern science, armed with DNA analysis and CT scanning technology that Carter could never have envisioned, has revealed a more sobering truth about the young king whose reign lasted barely 9 years before death claimed him at approximately 18 years of age. The genetic analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy, conducted in 2010 by an international team of researchers, solved one of Egyptology's most persistent mysteries, while revealing the horrific price paid for maintaining divine bloodlines. The boy king's parents were siblings. Father Akhenaten and his mother were sister and brother, children of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye. This brother-sister union, sanctified by religious tradition and political necessity, had produced a pharaoh whose body bore the accumulated damage of generations of consanguineous marriages within the Egyptian royal house. Akhenaten himself, the heretic pharaoh who had attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by worshipping a single solar deity, carried genetic burdens inherited from his own inbred ancestry. Contemporary art from his reign depicts him with elongated features, feminine hips, and an oddly shaped skull, characteristics that modern medical analysis suggests may have resulted from genetic disorders common among children of closely related parents. His radical religious reforms, which dismantled thousands of years of polytheistic tradition, may themselves have been influenced by the psychological instabilities that plagued his lineage. Tutankhamun's mother remains officially unnamed in ancient records, a deliberate obscurity that likely reflects the controversial nature of the sibling marriage that produced him. DNA evidence has identified her as the younger lady, a mummy discovered in 1898 and long considered a minor royal figure. Analysis of her remains reveals that she too bore the physical hallmarks of genetic stress-spinal abnormalities, dental problems, and bone malformations that speak to generations of concentrated breeding within the royal family. The young pharaoh's physical condition, revealed through painstaking analysis of his mummified remains, reads like a medical textbook devoted to the consequences of extreme inbreeding. His left foot was severely clubbed, forcing him to walk with a cane or crutches, a fact confirmed by the discovery of over 130 walking sticks buried with him in his tomb. The deformity was so pronounced that special sandals were crafted to accommodate his twisted foot, their asymmetrical design preserved in the dry desert air for over 3 millennia. Tutankhamun's spine curved abnormally, creating a pronounced scoliosis that would have affected his posture and gait. His ribcage was malformed, with one side flattened in a way that suggests either a congenital defect or damage from a fall possibly related to his mobility problems. Even his skull showed irregularities, with an enlarged cranial cavity that may have indicated hydrocephalus or other neurological complications stemming from his parents' genetic relationship. The golden treasures buried with Tutankhamun take on a more poignant meaning when viewed through the lens of his physical disabilities. The magnificent chariots, crafted with exquisite artistry and buried as symbols of royal power, may have been his only means of traveling at speed, compensating for feet that could barely support his weight. The throwing sticks and archery equipment, while part of traditional pharaonic burial goods, might also have represented adapted hunting methods for a king whose physical limitations required alternative approaches to traditional royal activities. Court records from Tutankhamun's reign, fragmentary but revealing, hint at the challenges of governing while suffering from multiple genetic disorders. Administrative papyri show an unusually heavy reliance on advisors and regents, suggesting that the young pharaoh's physical condition may have limited his direct participation in royal duties. The famous painted scenes in his tomb, showing him hunting from a chariot or receiving tribute from foreign lands, likely represent idealized versions of kingship rather than accurate depictions of his capabilities. The mystery of Tutankhamun's death has fascinated scholars for decades, with theories ranging from murder to chariot accidents to infectious disease. Modern medical analysis suggests a more complex picture, a young man whose genetic inheritance made him vulnerable to multiple health crises. CT scans reveal evidence of malaria parasites in his mummified tissues, while his bone structure shows signs of multiple injuries that may have accumulated over his short lifetime. His death was likely the result of his body's inability to cope with trauma that a healthier individual might have survived. Perhaps most tragically, Tutankhamun's own attempts to continue the royal bloodline ended in failure. His tomb contained the mummified remains of 2 infant daughters, both born prematurely and both carrying the genetic burden of their parents' relationship. Tutankhamun had married his half-sister Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, continuing the pattern of sibling marriage that had produced his own disabilities. Their daughters, with their delicate bones and developmental abnormalities preserved in miniature sarcophagi, represent the ultimate expression of a breeding program that prioritized bloodline purity over human survival. The religious upheaval that characterized Tutankhamun's era may itself have been connected to the genetic crisis afflicting the royal family. Akhenaten's radical monotheism, Tutankhamun's restoration of traditional gods, and the dynasty's eventual collapse all occurred during a period when royal genetics had reached a breaking point. The gods who had supposedly blessed sibling marriage for centuries seem to have abandoned the very bloodline that claimed divine sanction for its reproductive practices. Tutankhamun's burial equipment included medical supplies that provide additional evidence of his health struggles. Ebony and ivory medicine chests contained remedies for pain, inflammation, and digestive problems. Oils and unguents designed to treat skin conditions were stored in precious containers, while amulets intended to ensure physical wholeness in the afterlife suggest concerns about bodily integrity that may have stemmed from lifetime experience with disability. The irony of Tutankhamun's legacy is profound. The most famous pharaoh in modern popular culture was also one of the most genetically compromised rulers in Egyptian history. His golden treasures, preserved by the desert climate and hidden from tomb robbers for over 3,000 years, have made him a symbol of ancient Egyptian achievement. Yet his mummified body tells a different story, one of a civilization that had pushed the boundaries of genetic concentration so far that even divine kingship could not protect its practitioners from the biological consequences of their choices. When Tutankhamun died, probably in the winter of his 18th year, his death marked more than the end of a short reign. It represented the collapse of a genetic experiment that had lasted for generations, demonstrating that not even the blessing of the gods could overcome the fundamental laws of heredity. His tomb, with its unparalleled treasures and heartbreaking evidence of physical suffering, stands as both monument and warning, a golden testament to the price paid when political necessity overrides biological wisdom. Sibling thrones of Hawaii Kamehameha II, Queen Kamāmālu. In the gentle trade winds that sweep across the Hawaiian Islands, carrying the scent of plumeria and the sound of distant surf, a different tradition of royal sibling marriage unfolded on that would end not in the familiar corridors of European palaces but in the foggy, disease-ridden streets of London, where two young lovers would die far from the volcanic shores of their birth. The marriage of Kamehameha II and his sister Queen Kamāmālu represented the pinnacle of Hawaiian royal tradition, a sacred union that embodied the complex spiritual and political systems of Polynesian nobility, yet would ultimately prove as fragile as the tropical flowers that adorned their wedding ceremony. The Hawaiian concept of niaupio marriage differed fundamentally from the calculated political alliances that characterized European royal incest. Where Habsburg unions were designed to consolidate territories and concentrate bloodlines for dynastic advantage, Hawaiian sibling marriage was primarily a spiritual practice, based on the belief that the highest rank, that of ali'i kapu, or sacred chief, could only be maintained through the union of siblings who shared the divine manna inherited from their common parents. This wasn't merely about keeping power within the family, it was about preserving the spiritual energy that connected Hawaiian royalty to the gods themselves. Kamehameha II, known to his people as Liholiho, had inherited more than a kingdom when his father, the great Kamehameha I, died in 1819. He had received the responsibility of maintaining the kapu system, the complex network of sacred laws and taboos that governed Hawaiian society and distinguished the ali'i from the common people. His marriage to his sister Kamāmālu was not just a personal choice but a religious obligation, necessary to maintain the spiritual purity that legitimized his rule over the unified Hawaiian Islands. Kamāmālu herself embodied the grace and beauty associated with Hawaiian royal women. Contemporary accounts describe her as tall and elegant, with the regal bearing that marked her as ali'i kapu from birth. She moved through the royal compound at Honolulu, with the fluid motion characteristic of Hawaiian nobility, her kapa cloth garments rustling softly as she performed the ceremonial duties that fell to a queen of her sacred rank. Like all high-ranking Hawaiian women, she had been trained from childhood in the complex genealogies that determine status within the ali'i hierarchy, and she could recite her lineage back through dozens of generations to the legendary chiefs who had first settled the islands. Their marriage ceremony, conducted according to ancient Hawaiian tradition, took place beneath skies painted with the brilliant colors of a Pacific sunset. The couple exchanged lei made from rare feathers gathered from across the island, chain yellow ole feathers from the Big Island, red iwi feathers from Maui, and the precious green feathers of the Awahiʻo from Kauai. These lei, worth fortunes in traditional Hawaiian currency, symbolize not just the wealth of the royal house, but the spiritual connection between the ruling couple and the natural world they governed. The early years of their marriage unfolded in the complex social environment of early 19th century Hawaii, where traditional Polynesian culture was increasingly influenced by American missionaries and European traders. Kamehameha II and Kamāmalu ruled during a period of unprecedented change as their kingdom navigated between ancient traditions and modern pressures. The couple's court at Honolulu became a unique fusion of Hawaiian and Western customs, where traditional hula performances shared space with European-style diplomatic receptions. Yet, their sibling relationship carried genetic consequences that would become apparent as they matured. Both Kamehameha II and Kamāmalu exhibited health problems that may have stemmed from their shared ancestry. The king suffered from respiratory ailments that worsened over time, while Kamāmalu experienced what court observers described as periodic episodes of weakness and fatigue. These health issues, subtle at first, would prove significant when they encountered European diseases for which their concentrated genetics provided little resistance. The couple's attempts to produce an heir ended in repeated tragedy. Kamāmalu suffered several miscarriages, each loss mourning throughout the kingdom with traditional lamentations that echoed across the valleys and beaches of all the islands. Hawaiian court records, maintained by American missionary advisors, document these pregnancy losses with clinical detachment, but native accounts preserved in oral tradition speak of the Queen's profound grief and the King's growing concern about the succession. The decision to travel to England in 1823 represented both the height of Kamehameha II and Kamāmalu's ambitions and the beginning of their final tragedy. The royal couple, accompanied by a small retinue of Hawaiian nobles, embarked on the long voyage to London with the goal of meeting King George IV and establishing formal diplomatic relations between Hawaii and Great Britain. The journey itself was an extraordinary undertaking, the first time Hawaiian royalty had ventured beyond the Pacific, carrying their sacred genealogies and royal prerogatives into the alien world of European monarchy. London in 1824 was a city of coal smoke and crowded streets, an urban environment that could hardly have been more different from the tropical paradise the Hawaiian royals had left behind. The young couple, accustomed to the clean ocean air and open spaces of their island kingdom, found themselves struggling with the pollution and confinement of the world's largest city. Their lodgings, while luxurious by European standards, felt cramped and airless to people raised beneath open Hawaiian skies. The cultural shock went beyond mere environmental differences. Hawaiian nobles, trained in the fluid social interactions of Polynesian society, found themselves constrained by the rigid etiquette of Georgian England. Kamāmalu, accustomed to the relative freedom of Hawaiian royal women, discovered that English court protocol severely limited her movements and required her to defer to male authority in ways that conflicted with her training as an ali'i kapu. The couple's attempts to maintain Hawaiian customs within English social conventions created awkward situations that court observers found both fascinating and disturbing. Within weeks of their arrival, both Kamehameha III and Kamāmalu began showing symptoms of measles disease that was common and relatively mild among Europeans, but proved devastating to Pacific Islanders who had no genetic resistance to Old World pathogens. Their illness progressed rapidly, their bodies unable to mount effective immune responses against diseases their isolated gene pool had never encountered. English physicians, despite their best efforts, found themselves helpless against the physiological vulnerability that centuries of genetic isolation had created. Kamāmalu died first, on July 8, 1824, her death shocking the English court and devastating her husband. Kamehameha II, already weakened by his own case of measles, succumbed to grief as much as disease. He survived his sister wife by only 6 days, dying on July 14 in the same London lodgings where they had hoped to establish their kingdom's place among the world's great powers. Their deaths, so far from the volcanic shores and sacred valleys of their birth, marked the end of more than 2 lives. They represented the collision between ancient Polynesian traditions and the biological realities of the modern world. The bodies of Kamehameha II and Kamāmalu were returned to Hawaii aboard the British frigate HMS Blonde, their royal remains preserved in specially crafted koa wood caskets for the long voyage across the Pacific. Their funeral, conducted according to traditional Hawaiian rites augmented by Christian ceremonies, drew mourners from across the island chain. The keening cries of professional mourners mixed with Christian hymns, creating a sound of grief that seemed to echo the cultural confusion of their final months. Their tragic end in London highlighted the vulnerability that genetic isolation had created within Hawaiian royal bloodlines. While their sibling marriage had fulfilled the spiritual requirements of ali'i ikapu tradition, it had also concentrated genetic traits that left them defenseless against foreign diseases. Their deaths foreshadowed the demographic catastrophe that would soon overwhelm native Hawaiian populations, as European and American diseases swept through communities with no natural resistance to Old World pathogens. Inca royal twins HUAYNA CÁPAC'S legacy. High in the crystalline air of the Andes, where condors soar above terraced mountainsides and ancient stone cities cling to impossible precipices, the greatest empire of pre-Columbian America practiced a form of royal incest that surpassed even the most extreme European examples in its systematic concentration of bloodlines. The Inca Empire, stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile along the spine of South America, had elevated brother-sister marriage to the pinnacle of imperial ideology through the institution of the Coyatha sister queen, who was not merely consort but co-ruler, divine partner, and genetic twin to the Sapa Inca himself. HUAYNA CAPAC, whose name meant rich in youth, ruled the Inca Empire at its zenith in the early 16th century, commanding territories that encompassed millions of subjects, speaking dozens of languages across a geography so diverse it included tropical rainforests, high-altitude deserts, and snow-capped peaks reaching toward the heavens. Yet for all his earthly power, he remained bound by the same genetic imperatives that governed royal reproduction throughout his dynasty: sacred obligation to marry his own sister and produce heirs who carried the concentrated essence of Inca divinity. The Inca understanding of royal sibling marriage differed from both European political calculations and Hawaiian spiritual traditions. In Cusco, the empire's magnificent capital, where walls of perfectly fitted stone still stand as testimony to Inca engineering genius, brother-sister marriage was considered not merely appropriate, but necessary for maintaining the divine nature of the Sapa Inca. The emperor was believed to be the direct descendant of Inti, the sun god, and only union with a sister who shared this solar heritage could produce offspring worthy of imperial succession. HUAYNA CAPAC'S principal wife and sister, whose name has been lost to the Spanish chroniclers who recorded Inca history after the conquest, bore the title of Koya and wielded authority that European queens could never imagine. She was not merely the emperor's consort but his spiritual equal, participating in religious ceremonies where she served as the earthly representative of Mamakila, the moon goddess and wife of Inti. Their marriage represented the celestial union of sun and moon played out in human form, a cosmic drama that legitimized their rule over the empire's vast territories. The imperial court at Cusco, with its golden walls and sacred gardens where everything from corn stalks to llamas was crafted from precious metals, provided the setting for this divine marriage. The royal couple lived in palaces whose walls were lined with sheets of beaten gold, where they dined from golden vessels and walked on carpets woven from the finest vicuña wool. Yet beneath this incredible luxury lay the biological reality of their consanguineous uniona, genetic concentration that had been building within the Inca royal family for generations. Unlike European royal incest, which was often the product of limited marriage markets or political necessity, Inca sibling marriage was mandated by religious law and supported by elaborate theological justification. The emperor's divine nature was believed to be so concentrated that marriage to anyone other than a sister would dilute the sacred bloodline and compromise the spiritual foundations of the empire. This theological imperative created a breeding system more extreme than anything practiced by contemporary Old World monarchies. Huayna Cápac himself bore the physical markers of this genetic concentration. Spanish chroniclers, writing after the conquest, described him as unusually pale for a Native American, with features that differed markedly from those of his subjects. Some accounts suggest he suffered from chronic health problems that may have been related to his inbred ancestry, including digestive ailments and episodes of what Spanish observers interpreted as melancholy or madness. These symptoms, familiar to students of European royal genetics, hint at the biological price paid for maintaining divine bloodlines in the New World as well as the Old. The Coya, as both sister and wife to the emperor, occupied a unique position in Inca society that had no equivalent in European monarchies. She wielded independent authority over vast territories, controlled her own administrative apparatus, and commanded the loyalty of noble families throughout the empire. Yet she also shared her brother-husband's genetic burden, and Spanish accounts suggest she too suffered from health problems that may have stemmed from the concentrated breeding practices of the royal family. The royal couple's children, products of the most extreme form of consanguineous marriage practiced by any major world civilization, embodied both the political success and genetic fragility of the Inca system. Huayna Cápac fathered numerous children by his sister wife and by secondary wives drawn from noble families throughout the empire. But the children of the Coya held the highest rank and the strongest claim to imperial succession. These princes and princesses, with their concentrated Inca bloodlines, were raised in luxury but also carried the accumulated genetic burden of generations of sibling marriage. The empire's administrative structure reflected the importance of royal genetics in Inca ideology. Provincial governors and military commanders throughout the vast realm were required to trace their ancestry back to imperial bloodlines, creating a genetic hierarchy that paralleled the political chain of command. Marriage alliances between noble families were carefully negotiated to maintain appropriate concentrations of royal blood while avoiding the complete genetic isolation that might threaten the stability of local ruling houses. Yet even as Huayna Cápac ruled over the greatest empire in the Americas, invisible threats were approaching that would expose the vulnerability created by the Inca genetic system. Spanish conquistadors, carrying Old World diseases to which American populations had no resistance, were advancing northward from Panama. The emperor's concentrated bloodline, so carefully maintained to preserve divine authority, would prove defenseless against pathogens that had evolved alongside genetically diverse European and African populations. The first smallpox epidemic reached the Inca Empire sometime around 1525, spreading faster than news of its approach and devastating populations that had no genetic resistance to the disease. Huayna Cápac himself fell victim to what Spanish chroniclers called pestilence, dying in the northern city of Quito while attempting to consolidate imperial control over recently conquered territories. His death from disease foreshadowed the demographic catastrophe that would soon engulf the entire empire. The emperor's death triggered a succession crisis that revealed the weakness inherent in the Inca genetic system. His legitimate heir by the Coya, Ninan Cuyochi, had also died in the epidemic, leaving the empire divided between two surviving sons with competing claims. Huasca, son of the sister queen, controlled Cusco and the southern territories, while Atahualpa, son of a secondary wife, commanded loyalty in the northern provinces. The civil war that followed weakened the empire, just as Spanish conquistadors were preparing their assault on Inca civilization. The genetic concentration that had been designed to preserve Inca divine authority became a liability when faced with diseases that affected entire bloodlines. Royal families throughout the empire, all related through centuries of carefully controlled marriages, proved equally vulnerable to smallpox, measles, and other Old World pathogens. The very genetic purity that had legitimized their rule became the mechanism of their destruction. When Francisco Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors finally confronted the Inca Empire in 1532, they found a civilization already devastated by disease and civil war. The genetic system that had sustained Inca rule for centuries proved incapable of adapting to the biological challenge posed by European contact. The empire that Huayna Cápac had ruled at its zenith collapsed within a generation, its concentrated bloodlines no match for the genetic diversity and disease resistance of Old World populations. The tragic irony of the Inca genetic experiment was that it succeeded too well. By creating bloodlines of unparalleled purity and concentrating divine authority within a small group of closely related families, the empire had made itself exquisitely vulnerable to any threat that could affect its genetic foundation. The same sibling marriages that had legitimized Inca rule and maintained imperial unity became the pathway for catastrophe when European diseases encountered American populations with no evolutionary experience of Old World pathogens. Bourbon Spain revisited Philip V, Maria Luisa of Savoy. The morning mist that clung to the gardens of La Granja revealed a king walking among the fountains and hedgerows, muttering to himself in a mixture of French and Spanish, while his attendants followed at a respectful distance, their faces masks of diplomatic concern. Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon monarch to occupy the Spanish throne, had brought more than just a new dynasty to the ancient seat of Habsburg power. He had imported the concentrated bloodlines of French royalty, creating a genetic cocktail that would prove as volatile and unpredictable as the European wars his succession had triggered. Philip's path to the Spanish throne represented one of the most complex inheritance puzzles in European history. Born Philip, Duke of Anjou, he was the grandson of Louis XIV of France and Maria Theresa of Spain, making him the product of a marriage between first cousins who shared both Habsburg and Bourbon ancestry. When the pathetic Charles II of Spain died childless in 1700, Philip inherited not just a crown but the accumulated genetic burden of both major European royal houses' Habsburg melancholy mixed with Bourbon instability in proportions that would define his troubled reign. His marriage to Maria Luisa of Savoy in 1701 seemed politically astute, designed to cement an alliance between the new Bourbon Spain and the Italian states that might support his claim against Austrian Habsburg rivals. Maria Luisa brought impressive credentials to the union. She was the daughter of Victor Amadeus II of Savoy, a skilled military leader and political survivor, and Anne-Marie d'Orléans, connecting her to both Italian nobility and French royalty. Yet her genealogy also revealed the inevitable consequence of European royal marriage patterns. She was Philip's second cousin through multiple pathways, ensuring that their children would receive another dose of concentrated royal genetics. The young queen arrived in Madrid in 1701 to find a court still haunted by the genetic ghosts of the Habsburg era. The royal apartments, with their heavy tapestries and dark wooden furniture, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that matched Philip's increasingly morose temperament. Spanish courtiers, accustomed to the pathetic spectacle of Charles II's final years, watched their new king with careful attention for signs of the mental instability that had plagued his predecessors. Maria Luisa herself brought a vitality to the Spanish court that had been absent during the final Habsburg decades. Contemporary portraits show her as an attractive woman with the intelligent eyes and determined expression characteristic of Savoy nobility. She threw herself into the complex rituals of Spanish court life with energy that initially charmed both courtiers and common people, learning Spanish with remarkable speed and adapting to the rigid etiquette that governed royal behavior. Yet beneath her apparent health and vigor lay genetic vulnerabilities that would become apparent as her marriage progressed. The early years of their marriage unfolded against the backdrop of the War of the Spanish Succession, as Philip fought to maintain his throne against Austrian Habsburg claimants supported by England and other European powers. The stress of warfare, combined with the genetic predispositions he had inherited, began to manifest in Philip's behavior within months of his accession. Court physicians noted episodes of profound melancholy, during which the king would refuse food, ignore state business, and spend days staring silently from palace windows. Maria Luisa's attempts to manage her husband's psychological crises required all the diplomatic skills of her Savoy heritage. She learned to recognize the early signs of Philip's depressive episodes, quietly rearranging court schedules and deflecting diplomatic obligations when the king entered periods of incapacity. Spanish state archives preserve letters in which she describes her husband's condition in careful terms, designed to preserve royal dignity, while conveying the severity of his mental state to trusted advisors. Their reproductive life reflected the complex inheritance patterns that characterized European royal genetics. Maria Louisa bore 4 sons who survived infancy: Louis, Ferdinand, Charles, and Philip, each carrying different combinations of Bourbon, Habsburg, and Savoy genetic material. The children's personalities and capabilities varied dramatically, suggesting the unpredictable ways in which concentrated bloodlines could express themselves across generations. Some showed the intellectual brilliance associated with their royal heritage, while others exhibited the emotional instability that had plagued both Habsburg and Bourbon lines. The Queen's own health began to deteriorate during her childbearing years, manifesting symptoms that Spanish court physicians attributed to excessive motherly devotion, but which modern analysis suggests may have resulted from the stress of repeated pregnancies combined with genetic predispositions inherited from her own inbred ancestry. She suffered from chronic fatigue, digestive problems, and episodes of what contemporary accounts describe as nervous exhaustion, symptoms familiar to historians studying the medical records of inbred European royalty. Philip's mental condition worsened dramatically following Maria Louisa's death in 1714. The loss of his wife, who had served as both emotional anchor and practical manager of his psychological crises, triggered a descent into madness that shocked even courtiers accustomed to royal eccentricity. He began to believe that he was already dead, refusing to change clothes or attend to personal hygiene because, as he explained to horrified attendants, corpses have no need for such earthly concerns. The king's delusion of being deceased created unprecedented challenges for Spanish governance. State business ground to a halt as Philip refused to sign documents, claiming that dead men could not conduct the affairs of the living. He would spend hours examining his reflection in mirrors, searching for signs of decay that would confirm his deceased status. Court physicians, limited by 18th century understanding of mental illness, could only observe and document behavior that clearly stemmed from genetic predispositions towards psychological instability. His remarriage to Elizabeth Farnese of Parma in 1714, arranged hastily to address both succession concerns and hopes of stabilizing the king's mental state, brought temporary improvement to Philip's condition. Elizabeth, a strong-willed Italian princess with her own concentration of noble bloodlines, proved capable of managing her husband's psychological episodes while pursuing aggressive foreign policies designed to reclaim Spanish territories in Italy. Yet even her determined efforts could not permanently overcome the genetic inheritance that shaped Philip's personality. The couple's children, including the future Charles III of Spain, carried forward the mixed genetic legacy of multiple European royal houses. Elizabeth's Farnese ancestry, itself the product of careful Italian noble breeding, added another layer of genetic concentration to bloodlines already saturated with Habsburg and Bourbon characteristics. These children would inherit not just crowns and territories, but psychological and physical traits that would influence Spanish history for generations. Philip's abdication in 1724, ostensibly motivated by religious concerns about the morality of kingship, reflected the ongoing influence of mental instability inherited from his ancestors. He transferred the crown to his teenage son, Louis, only to resume the throne 8 months later when Louis died suddenly of smallpox. This unprecedented cycle of abdication and restoration demonstrated how genetic predispositions towards psychological instability could disrupt even the most fundamental principles of monarchical succession. The king's final years were marked by increasing episodes of what court observers described as sacred madness, religious obsessions that led him to spend days in prayer while neglecting affairs of state. He would wake his courtiers in the middle of the night to conduct impromptu religious services, convinced that immediate prayer was necessary to prevent cosmic catastrophe. These episodes, while interpreted through the religious framework of 18th century Spain, clearly reflected the mental instability that had plagued inbred European royalty for centuries. When Philip V finally died in 1746, after a reign of 45 years marked by war, abdication, restoration, and recurring madness, he left a Spanish monarchy that had successfully transitioned from Habsburg to Bourbon rule but remained haunted by the genetic legacy of European royal inbreeding. His death marked not the end of this genetic inheritance but its transformation, as Bourbon bloodlines carrying Habsburg characteristics would continue to influence Spanish royalty into the modern era. The marriage of Philip V and Maria Louisa of Savoy demonstrated that changing dynasties could not escape the fundamental problem of European royal genetics. Despite importing fresh Bourbon blood to replace exhausted Habsburg lineages, the new Spanish monarchy remained trapped within the same patterns of consanguineous marriage that had created the genetic catastrophe of Charles II. Their story served as a reminder that royal bloodlines, once concentrated through generations of careful breeding, could not be easily diluted or purified. The genetic burden would continue to manifest across centuries, shaping both individual lives and the broader course of European history. The Wittelsbach puzzle king, Ludwig I of Bavaria. In the romantic valleys of Bavaria, where medieval castles perch on wooded hills and church bells echo across alpine meadows, the Wittelsbach dynasty had spent centuries weaving a genealogical tapestry so complex that even trained court genealogists required detailed charts to trace the family relationships that bound generation to generation in an ever-tightening spiral of consanguinity. King Ludwig I, who ruled Bavaria from 1825 to 1848, emerged from this genetic labyrinth as both its most cultured product and one of its most tragic examples, a monarch whose artistic genius and romantic idealism could not overcome the accumulated burden of Wittelsbach inbreeding. The Wittelsbach approach to royal marriage had always been more cautious than the extreme sibling unions of ancient Egypt or the calculated Habsburg alliances that dominated Central European politics. Instead, they practiced what genealogists call line breeding, a systematic pattern of cousin marriages designed to concentrate desirable traits while avoiding the most obvious genetic pitfalls. First cousins married, second cousins, uncles wed nieces, and each generation showed slightly more genetic concentration than the last, creating a slow-motion genetic experiment that spanned centuries. Ludwig himself embodied both the artistic brilliance and underlying fragility that characterized his lineage. Born in 1786 as the product of a marriage between second cousins who shared multiple Wittelsbach ancestors, he displayed from childhood the aesthetic sensitivity that would define his reign and the emotional volatility that would ultimately destroy it. His education, conducted by the finest tutors available to German nobility, revealed an intellect of unusual intensity combined with a personality prone to obsessive enthusiasms and sudden periods of melancholic withdrawal. His marriage to Therese of Saxe-Hildburghausen in 1810 appeared to offer the possibility of genetic refreshment, as Therese's Saxon ancestry provided bloodlines that had not been extensively mixed with Wittelsbach genetics. The wedding celebration, which lasted for days and included the founding of Oktoberfest as an annual commemoration, seemed to herald a new era of Bavarian prosperity and genetic health. Yet closer genealogical analysis revealed that even this supposedly fresh union involved fourth cousins who shared common ancestors through the complex network of German noble families. Therese brought to the marriage not just Saxon genetics but also a practical intelligence that complemented Ludwig's artistic temperament. Contemporary accounts describe her as a stabilizing influence during the early years of their marriage, providing the emotional anchor that allowed Ludwig to channel his creative energies into constructive projects. She bore 9 children who survived infancy, an impressive record by royal standards, yet several showed signs of the neurological vulnerabilities that plagued Wittelsbach bloodlines. The king's artistic patronage, which transformed Munich into one of Europe's great cultural centers, reflected both the positive and negative aspects of his genetic inheritance. Ludwig's aesthetic vision, influenced by his admiration for ancient Greece and his romantic conception of German nationalism, led him to commission magnificent buildings, acquire important art collections, and support writers and musicians whose work would influence European culture for generations. Yet his artistic enthusiasm often crossed the line into obsession, consuming state resources and royal attention in ways that suggested the compulsive behavior patterns common among children of consanguineous marriages. Munich under Ludwig I became a living museum of romantic architecture and classical revival, with new buildings designed to evoke the glory of ancient Athens and the power of German cultural achievement. The Königsplatz, with its neoclassical proportions and careful symmetry, represented Ludwig's vision of Bavaria as the cultural heir to ancient Greece. Yet the enormous expense of these projects, combined with the king's tendency to pursue multiple architectural schemes simultaneously, created financial strains that reflected the impulsive decision-making that characterized his personality. The king's collecting mania extended beyond architecture to encompass paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, and what contemporaries described as an almost pathological obsession with beautiful women. Ludwig's Gallery of Beauties in Nymphenburg Palace, featuring portraits of women from all social classes who had caught his aesthetic attention, represented more than mere royal eccentricity. The systematic way he pursued and documented female beauty suggested the kind of obsessive behavior that psychiatric historians recognize as common among individuals with certain genetic predispositions. His most famous romantic obsession with the Irish-born dancer Lola Montez demonstrated how the Wittelsbach tendency toward compulsive behavior could manifest in political catastrophe. Ludwig's infatuation with Montez, whom he elevated to the nobility as Countess of Landsfeld despite her questionable background and radical political views, scandalized conservative Bavarian society and provided his political opponents with ammunition for attacks on royal competence. The king's inability to control his passion, despite clear evidence of its political costs, reflected the kind of impaired judgment that geneticists associate with certain hereditary conditions. The royal children, products of Wittelsbach Saxon genetics, displayed varying degrees of their father's artistic gifts and emotional instability. Crown Prince Maximilian showed intellectual promise combined with social awkwardness that made public appearances painful for both himself and observers. Prince Otto exhibited early signs of the mental illness that would later make him unfit to rule, requiring careful management by court physicians who understood the family's genetic vulnerabilities. The daughters generally fared better, though several showed the intense artistic sensibilities and emotional fragility that characterized the Wittelsbach temperament. Ludwig's political judgment, particularly regarding German nationalism and liberal constitutional reforms, reflected the same pattern of brilliant insights, followed by catastrophic miscalculations that marked his aesthetic and romantic pursuits. His early support for Greek independence and German cultural unity demonstrated genuine political vision, yet his inability to moderate his enthusiasms or consider practical consequences repeatedly undermined his effectiveness as a ruler. The revolutionary events of 1848, which forced his abdication, resulted partly from his failure to balance romantic idealism with political realism. The king's physical appearance, documented in numerous portraits and contemporary descriptions, showed typical Wittelsbach characteristics that had become more pronounced through generations of controlled breeding. He possessed the family's characteristic high forehead and prominent nose, combined with an artistic sensibility that expressed itself in his careful attention to personal appearance and court ceremony. Yet observers also noted signs of the physical strain that seemed to affect many Wittelsbach males. Episodes of illness that court physicians attributed to nervous exhaustion and periods of lethargy that suggested underlying health problems. His hearing loss, which became progressively worse during his later years, may have resulted from genetic factors rather than age or injury. Several Wittelsbach family members across multiple generations experienced similar auditory problems, suggesting an inherited condition that affected the family's ability to function normally in social and political situations. Ludwig's increasing reliance on written communication during his final years as king reflected not just personal preference, but practical necessity imposed by his genetic inheritance. The revolution of 1848 that forced Ludwig's abdication represented more than political upheaval. It marked the collision between romantic nationalism and practical governance, between artistic vision and administrative competence. Ludwig's inability to distinguish between his aesthetic ideals and political reality, combined with his compulsive pursuit of beauty in various forms, had created the conditions for his downfall. His abdication in favor of his son Maximilian II represented an admission that genetic predispositions had made effective kingship impossible. In retirement, Ludwig continued to exhibit the obsessive patterns that had characterized his reign, pursuing architectural projects and artistic acquisitions with the same intensity that had marked his royal years. His death, in 1868, following a mysterious late-night walk near Lake Starnberg, sparked conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Yet the most likely explanation for his demise involved the same genetic factors that had shaped his life, a combination of physical vulnerability and emotional instability that made him susceptible to the kind of impulsive behavior could prove fatal. The Wittelsbach puzzle that Ludwig represented the combination of extraordinary artistic gifts with crippling psychological vulnerabilities would continue to manifest in subsequent generations. His grandson, the fairy tale castle builder Ludwig II, would demonstrate even more extreme versions of the same traits, while other family members would struggle with mental illness, political incompetence, and the social isolation that accompanied their genetic burden. The dynasty's careful breeding program, designed to preserve and concentrate noble characteristics, had created individuals of remarkable cultural achievement who were fundamentally unsuited for the practical demands of modern monarchy. Portugal's Braganza loop, Queen Maria I, King Peter III. In the soft light that filters through Lisbon's morning mist, where the Tagus River meets the Atlantic and carries the dreams of Portuguese explorers toward distant shores, a queen knelt in prayer before a golden crucifix, her whispered entreaties mixing Latin petitions with Portuguese endearments as she sought divine forgiveness for sins both real and imagined. Maria I of Portugal, known to history as Maria the Mad, ruled during one of the most turbulent periods in European history, yet her personal struggles with mental illness reflected not merely the pressures of monarchy, but the genetic consequences of a marriage that represented the most extreme example of consanguineous union in Portuguese royal history. The marriage of Maria and Peter III violated even the relaxed standards of 18th-century royal incest, as the couple were not merely cousins but aunt and nephew. Maria was the daughter of King José I, while Peter was José's younger brother. This union, which required special papal dispensation and caused scandal even among courtiers accustomed to royal peculiarities, was arranged to solve the succession crisis created by José I's lack of male heirs. By marrying his daughter to his brother, the king ensured that Portuguese royal blood would remain undiluted while keeping the crown within the immediate family circle. The genealogical mathematics of their relationship created a genetic concentration that exceeded even Habsburg standards of consanguinity. Maria and Peter shared not just grandparents but great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and an intricate web of ancestors stretching back through centuries of Portuguese royal intermarriage. Their children would be simultaneously cousins, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren of the same individuals, creating genetic combinations that nature had never intended and science could not yet understand. Maria herself, born in 1734, had been raised with the expectation that she would rule Portugal in her own right, an unusual situation that reflected both Portuguese legal traditions and her father's pragmatic acceptance of his dynasty's reproductive limitations. Her education included training in statecraft that was typically reserved for male heirs, yet it also emphasized religious devotion with an intensity that would prove prophetic given her later psychological development. Contemporary accounts describe her as an intelligent child with an almost mystical dedication to Catholic ritual and an early tendency toward the kind of scrupulous examination of conscience that would later manifest as pathological guilt. Peter III, her uncle and future husband, brought his own genetic burden to their union. Born in 1717, he was 17 years older than Maria, and already showing signs of the physical and mental weaknesses that characterized the Braganza line. Court physicians noted his chronic digestive problems, episodes of what they termed nervous agitation, and a tendency toward obsessive religious observance that mirrored his niece's spiritual intensity. Their shared religious enthusiasm, while politically useful in Catholic Portugal, would prove psychologically destructive when combined with the genetic predispositions toward mental illness that both carried. The wedding ceremony in 1760 took place in the magnificent Basilica da Estrela, with its soaring Baroque architecture and golden decorations that reflected Portugal's wealth from Brazilian gold and diamonds. The bride, at 26, appeared composed and regal in portraits commissioned for the occasion, though observers noted an intensity in her dark eyes that suggested depths of emotion carefully controlled. Peter, at 43, seemed prematurely aged, his hair already greying and his posture stooped in a way that made him appear older than his years. Their early married life unfolded in the sumptuous palaces of Lisbon and Sintra, where Brazilian gold had funded artistic projects that rivaled Versailles in their opulence. The royal couple lived surrounded by azulejo tiles depicting religious scenes, gilt furniture imported from France, and paintings by European masters acquired with colonial wealth. Yet beneath this surface luxury lay the biological reality of their consanguineous union, which would manifest in both their own health problems and the tragic fate of their children. Maria's first pregnancy, announced with traditional celebrations and Thanksgiving masses throughout the kingdom, ended in miscarriage during the 5th month, a loss that devastated the royal couple and sparked the first signs of the Queen's later mental instability. Court records, preserved in Portuguese archives, document her extreme grief reaction, which included refusing food for days and spending hours prostrate before religious images while begging divine forgiveness for unnamed sins she believed had caused the pregnancy loss. The couple's eventual success in producing surviving children came at enormous physical and emotional cost. Their son José, born in 1761, appeared healthy at birth, but soon showed signs of developmental delays that court physicians attributed to an excess of melancholic humors. Modern genetic analysis suggests he likely suffered from intellectual disabilities related to his parents' consanguineous relationship. Their daughter, Maria Francisca, born in 1764, exhibited the pale, fragile beauty characteristic of inbred Portuguese royalty but died at age 24 from what court records describe as a wasting illness of unknown origin. The devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which occurred 5 years before Maria's marriage but profoundly influenced her psychological development, had already established a connection in her mind between divine judgment and earthly catastrophe. The earthquake, which killed an estimated 60 people and destroyed much of Lisbon, was interpreted by Portuguese clergy as divine punishment for national sins. Maria, still a young woman when the disaster struck, internalized this theological explanation in ways that would resurface during her later mental breakdown. When Maria finally assumed the throne in 1777 following her father's death, she inherited a kingdom grappling with the aftereffects of earthquake reconstruction, colonial pressures in Brazil, and the broader European upheavals that would culminate in the French Revolution. Her early years as queen showed remarkable competence, as she implemented legal reforms, promoted religious tolerance, and attempted to modernize Portuguese administration. Yet the stresses of rulership, combined with her genetic predispositions, gradually revealed the psychological fragility that had been developing since childhood. The crisis that triggered Maria's complete mental breakdown began with the death of her confessor, Father Inácio de São Caetano, in 1785. This priest had served as her spiritual director for over 20 years, helping her navigate the complex relationship between royal duty and religious devotion. His death removed the psychological anchor that had helped her maintain emotional stability during the challenging early years of her reign. Within months, courtiers noted alarming changes in the Queen's behavior and religious observances. Maria's descent into madness manifested first as religious scrupulosity that exceeded even Portuguese standards of Catholic devotion. She began to believe that she was personally responsible for the damnation of her subjects, spending entire nights in prayer while begging God to transfer their sins to her own soul. Court observers reported that she would interrupt state business to confess imaginary transgressions to priests summoned at all hours. Her religious advisor wrote detailed accounts of these episodes, describing a woman tortured by guilt over sins that existed only in her increasingly disturbed mind. The Queen's condition worsened dramatically following news of the French Revolution and the execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The deaths of fellow monarchs, combined with her existing religious obsessions, convinced Maria that divine judgment was sweeping across Europe and that she was destined for eternal damnation. She began to experience what court physicians described as visions of hellfire, during which she would scream about demons pursuing her through the palace corridors. These episodes, which could last for hours, required the intervention of multiple attendants to prevent the Queen from injuring herself in her terror. Peter III's death in 1786 removed the last stabilizing influence from Maria's life, leaving her alone with her genetic predispositions and psychological torments. The loss of her husband-uncle, despite their complex relationship, triggered a grief reaction that merged with her existing religious mania to create episodes of behavior so disturbing that the royal court could no longer maintain the fiction of her competence. Foreign diplomats reported that audiences with the Portuguese Queen had become impossible due to her tendency to interrupt diplomatic discussions with confessions of imaginary sins or warnings about impending divine judgment. The formal transfer of power to her son João in 1799, while maintaining the legal fiction that Maria remained queen, marked the effective end of her reign and the beginning of a tragic twilight period that would last until her death in 1816. The royal court's relocation to Brazil in 1807, fleeing Napoleon's invasion of Portugal, provided a temporary change of scene but could not overcome the fundamental genetic and psychological factors that had destroyed her mental stability. She spent her final years in Rio de Janeiro, attended by Portuguese physicians who could document but not treat the consequences of Braganza inbreeding that had reached their inevitable conclusion in her tortured mind. Savoy's closed-circle victor, Amadeus II. In the shadow of the Alps, where morning snow catches fire in the early light and medieval strongholds guard ancient passes between France and Italy, the House of Savoy had spent centuries navigating the treacherous currents of European politics through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and careful attention to the genetic composition of their bloodlines. Victor Amadeus II, who ruled as Duke of Savoy from 1675 to 1730 and became the first King of Sardinia, emerged from this Alpine tradition as both its most successful practitioner and a tragic example of how political brilliance could not overcome the biological constraints imposed by generations of strategic inbreeding. The Savoy approach to royal marriage reflected the unique geographic and political position of their territories, squeezed between the great powers of France, Austria, and Spain, yet controlling Alpine passes that were crucial to European trade and military movement. Unlike dynasties that could afford the luxury of marrying for love or even simple political alliance, the Savoys had to calculate each union with mathematical precision, balancing the need for powerful allies against the equally pressing requirement to maintain bloodline purity that would legitimize their claims to royal status among Europe's established monarchies. Victor Amadeus himself was the product of such calculated breeding. Born in 1666 to Charles Emmanuel II of Savoy and Marie-Jeanne Baptiste of Savoy-Nemours, marriage between first cousins that concentrated Savoy genetics while cementing political alliances within the extended family network. His parents' union represented the kind of careful genealogical planning that characterized Savoy marriage policy, close enough to ensure genetic concentration and political reliability, distant enough to avoid the most obvious manifestations of inbreeding that might compromise the dynasty's military effectiveness. The young duke's education reflected both the martial traditions of his house and the intellectual sophistication required for survival in the complex diplomatic environment of late 17th century Europe. He learned to fence with the precision of a professional soldier, studied fortification engineering with masters who had designed defenses against Louis XIV's armies, and absorbed lessons in statecraft from advisors who understood that Savoy's independence depended on playing greater powers against each other with perfect timing and absolute ruthlessness. Yet even as Victor Amadeus developed the skills that would make him one of Europe's most effective rulers, His genetic inheritance began to manifest in ways that would influence both his personal relationships and his political decision-making. Court physicians noted his tendency toward what they diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion, episodes of intense energy followed by periods of profound lethargy that suggested the kind of mood instability common among children of consanguineous marriages. These psychological cycles would prove both blessing and curse, driving him to extraordinary achievements while also creating periods of impaired judgment that threatened everything he had built. His marriage to Anne-Marie d'Orléans in 1684 appeared to offer the possibility of genetic refreshment, as Anne-Marie brought French royal bloodlines that had not been extensively mixed with Savoy genetics. The daughter of Philip I, Duke of Orleans, and Henrietta of England, she carried the blood of both French Bourbons and English Stuarts, creating the prospect that her children with Victor Amadeus might inherit genetic diversity that could strengthen the Savoy line. Yet genealogical analysis revealed that even this supposedly fresh union involved distant cousins who shared ancestors through the complex network of European royal intermarriage. Anne-Marie's arrival at the Savoy court in Turin brought not just genetic diversity, but also a sophisticated understanding of European politics gained from her upbringing at Versailles. Contemporary accounts describe her as an intelligent woman who quickly grasped the delicate balance required to maintain Savoy independence while navigating between France, Austria, and Spain. Her correspondence, preserved in Savoy archives, reveals a sharp political mind combined with genuine affection for her husband, despite the arranged nature of their marriage and the genetic burdens both carried. The couple's reproductive success initially seemed to vindicate the wisdom of their union, as Anne-Marie bore children who survived infancy at rates that exceeded contemporary royal averages. Their son, Victor Amadeus, born in 1687, appeared robust and intelligent, while their daughters showed the beauty and intelligence that characterized successful Savoy women. Yet closer examination revealed subtle signs of the genetic stress that affected many children of royal marriages, developmental delays that were carefully concealed by court protocol, episodes of illness that required discreet medical intervention, and personality traits that suggested psychological vulnerabilities inherited from their concentrated bloodlines. Victor Amadeus's military campaigns, which established his reputation as one of Europe's most capable generals, reflected both the positive and negative aspects of his genetic inheritance. His strategic brilliance during the War of the Spanish Succession, when he successfully played France and Austria against each other while expanding Savoy territories, demonstrated the kind of intellectual acuity that royal breeding programs were designed to preserve. Yet his tendency toward obsessive planning and inability to delegate authority suggested compulsive traits that psychiatric historians recognize as common among individuals with certain genetic predispositions. The Duke's transformation of Turin from a provincial capital into one of Europe's most beautiful Baroque cities represented another manifestation of his complex personality. His architectural patronage, which included commissioning magnificent palaces and churches that still grace the city today, reflected both genuine aesthetic vision and the kind of grandiose thinking that characterized many members of inbred royal families. The enormous expense of these projects, combined with his tendency to pursue multiple building schemes simultaneously, created financial strains that threatened the very military effectiveness his architectural displays were designed to celebrate. His elevation to King of Sardinia in 1720, following the complex territorial exchanges that concluded the War of the Spanish Succession, marked the pinnacle of Savoy political achievement and the beginning of Victor Amadeus's psychological decline. The responsibilities of kingship, combined with the accumulated stress of decades of warfare and diplomacy, triggered episodes of behavior that court observers found increasingly disturbing. Foreign ambassadors reported that audiences with the king had become unpredictable affairs, as Victor Amadeus might interrupt diplomatic discussions to deliver monologues about architectural plans or military strategies that bore little relation to the business at hand. The death of Anne-Marie in 1728 removed the stabilizing influence that had helped Victor Amadeus manage his psychological vulnerabilities for over 4 decades. Her loss triggered a grief reaction that exceeded normal mourning and descended into what court physicians described as melancholic madness. The king began to believe that his deceased wife was still alive and present in the palace, setting places for her at meals and conducting conversations with empty chairs. These episodes, while interpreted through the religious framework of 18th-century Catholicism, clearly reflected the kind of mental breakdown that geneticists associate with certain hereditary conditions. Victor Amadeus's abdication in 1730, ostensibly motivated by religious concerns about the morality of kingship, actually resulted from his recognition that his psychological condition had made effective rulership impossible. His transfer of the crown to his son Charles Emmanuel III represented an unprecedented admission of mental incapacity that shocked European courts accustomed to monarchs who ruled until death regardless of their condition. The formal documents of abdication, preserved in Savoy archives, reveal a mind still capable of lucid analysis yet tormented by delusions and obsessions that made normal functioning impossible. His brief attempt to reclaim the throne in 1731, following disputes with his son over the terms of his abdication, demonstrated how genetic predispositions toward impulsive behavior could override rational calculation. The political crisis triggered by his change of mind threatened to destabilize the kingdom he had spent decades building, while his erratic behavior during the attempted restoration convinced even his supporters that his original abdication had been necessary. His subsequent imprisonment in the castle of Rivoli, while officially described as protective custody, actually represented the dynasty's recognition that genetic factors had made their patriarch too dangerous to remain at liberty. Victor Amadeus's death in 1732, alone in his castle prison while his son ruled the kingdom he had created, marked the end of one of Europe's most successful military and political careers and demonstrated the tragic consequences that could result when royal genetics reached their breaking point. His funeral, conducted with appropriate ceremony but limited attendance, reflected the complex legacy of a ruler whose achievements had been both enabled and ultimately destroyed by the genetic inheritance that defined his bloodline. The Savoy tradition of strategic inbreeding, perfected during Victor Amadeus's lifetime, would continue for generations as his descendants attempted to balance the competing demands of political necessity and genetic health. Yet his tragic end served as a warning that even the most successful royal breeding programs carried hidden costs that might not manifest until accumulated genetic damage reached critical thresholds, transforming assets into liabilities and strength into fatal vulnerability. Habsburg, Austria. After Spain, Maria Theresa, Francis Stephen. In the gilded halls of the Hofburg Palace, where crystalline chandeliers cast dancing shadows across portraits of long-dead emperors, a young woman sat reading dispatches from across her vast domains while her husband played with their latest infant, his gentle voice cooing German lullabies that had soothed Habsburg children for generations. Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis Stephen of Lorraine represented what their contemporaries celebrated as a rare love match among European royalty. Yet even this romantic union could not escape the gravitational pull of Habsburg genetics that had been concentrating bloodlines for centuries across the courts of Europe. Their marriage in 1736 had been arranged by pragmatic parents seeking to strengthen Austrian alliances with the independent Duchy of Lorraine, but the young couple's genuine affection for each other surprised courtiers accustomed to the cold political calculations that typically governed royal unions. Maria Theresa, inheritor of the Habsburg domains through her father's pragmatic sanction, brought to the marriage not just vast territories stretching from Hungary to the Netherlands, but also the accumulated genetic legacy of centuries of strategic inbreeding that had made the Habsburg name synonymous with both imperial power and physical deformity. Francis Stephen appeared to offer genetic salvation for the Habsburg line, as his Lorraine ancestry had developed independently of the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg breeding programs that had produced such catastrophic results in figures like Charles II of Spain. Yet genealogical analysis revealed that even this supposedly fresh union involved second cousins who shared Habsburg ancestors through the complex web of European royal intermarriage. The mathematical precision of royal breeding meant that true genetic diversity had become virtually impossible within the narrow circle of families considered suitable for imperial marriage. Maria Theresa herself embodied both the strengths and vulnerabilities of her Habsburg inheritance. Contemporary portraits show her as an attractive woman with the intelligent eyes and determined expression that had characterized successful Habsburg rulers. Yet court physicians documented the chronic health problems that plagued her throughout her childbearing years. She suffered from what 18th-century medicine termed female weakness, a vague diagnosis that encompassed the reproductive difficulties, mood instabilities, and physical frailties that genetic historians now recognize as common among children of consanguineous marriages. Francis Stephen, despite his reputation for charm and diplomatic skill, carried his own genetic burden inherited from the Lorraine ducal family, which had practiced its own version of strategic inbreeding for generations. Court observers noted his tendency toward what they diplomatically called nervous agitation, episodes of anxiety and compulsive behavior that suggested psychological vulnerabilities passed down through his own concentrated bloodlines. His genuine love for Maria Theresa provided emotional stability that helped both partners manage their inherited predispositions, yet it could not eliminate the genetic factors that would influence their children's development. The couple's extraordinary fertility, 16 children born over 20 years, initially seemed to vindicate the wisdom of their union and suggest that Habsburg genetic problems might be resolving themselves through the introduction of Lorraine bloodlines. Their children included future emperors, queens of France and Naples, and duchesses who would carry Habsburg genetics into royal houses across Europe. Yet this reproductive success masked underlying genetic realities that would become apparent as their offspring matured and faced the challenges of adult life. Their first son, Joseph, born in 1741, appeared to inherit the best qualities of both parental line's intellectual brilliance, combined with emotional stability that had been rare among recent Habsburg heirs. His education proceeded smoothly, revealing a mind capable of grasping complex philosophical and political concepts while maintaining the practical judgment necessary for effective rulership. Yet even Joseph carried subtle signs of his genetic inheritance: episodes of melancholy that lasted for weeks, obsessive perfectionism that made delegation nearly impossible, and the characteristic Habsburg tendency toward grandiose projects that consumed resources while producing questionable results. The couple's daughters faced their own genetic challenges as they married into royal houses across Europe and attempted to produce the next generation of European nobility. Maria Antonia, who became Queen Marie Antoinette of France, carried Habsburg genetics into the Bourbon bloodline, creating combinations that would contribute to the psychological instabilities that characterized the final years of the French monarchy. Her reproductive difficulties and eventual execution during the French Revolution reflected not just political circumstances, but also the genetic vulnerabilities that made adaptation to changing conditions increasingly difficult for European royal families. Maria Theresa's approach to motherhood reflected both genuine maternal affection and the calculated breeding strategies that had governed Habsburg family planning for centuries. She maintained detailed correspondence with her married daughters, providing advice about pregnancy, child-rearing, and the management of genetic traits that might affect their children's development. Her letters, preserved in Habsburg archives, reveal a woman who understood intuitively that royal bloodlines carried both privileges and burdens that required careful management across generations. The imperial court at Vienna during Maria Theresa's reign became a laboratory for observing the effects of controlled breeding on human development. Court physicians, working with the limited scientific understanding of their era, documented patterns of illness, behavioral traits, and physical characteristics that appeared with unusual frequency among Habsburg family members. Their clinical observations, recorded in medical Latin that allowed discussion of intimate details while maintaining appropriate discretion, provide modern geneticists with invaluable data about the long-term consequences of royal inbreeding. Francis Stephen's sudden death in 1765 while attending the opera in Innsbruck, devastated Maria Theresa and triggered a grief reaction that revealed the depth of their emotional bond. Her mourning exceeded conventional royal protocol and descended into what court observers described as inconsolable sorrow that lasted for the remaining 15 years of her life. She adopted black clothing as permanent mourning dress, transformed their private apartments into a shrine to Francis's memory, and conducted conversations with his portrait that suggested psychological responses similar to those that had affected other widowed members of inbred royal families. The transfer of imperial responsibilities to their son Joseph II following Francis's death marked both the continuation of Habsburg dynastic tradition and the beginning of a new phase in the family's genetic experiment. Joseph, as co-ruler with his mother and eventual sole emperor, demonstrated both the intellectual capabilities that royal breeding programs were designed to preserve and the psychological instabilities that represented their unintended consequences. His reform programs, while often brilliant in conception, showed the kind of obsessive thoroughness and inability to compromise that characterized many Habsburg personalities. Maria Theresa's own death in 1780 marked the end of an era in Habsburg history and the beginning of what historians recognize as the final phase of the dynasty's genetic experiment. Her children and grandchildren would carry forward the concentrated bloodlines she and Francis had created, yet they would face challenges that their genetic inheritance made increasingly difficult to navigate. The French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and social changes of the late 18th and early 19th centuries would test royal bloodlines in ways that breeding programs had never anticipated. The Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty that emerged from Maria Theresa and Francis Stephen's union represented both the apotheosis and the beginning of the end of European royal genetics. Their children possessed intellectual and cultural achievements that justified centuries of careful breeding, yet they also carried psychological and physical vulnerabilities that would make adaptation to modern conditions increasingly difficult. The love match that had seemed to offer hope for genetic renewal had instead created new combinations of traits that would prove both blessing and curse for future generations. The mathematical precision that had governed Habsburg breeding for centuries reached its logical conclusion in the children of Maria Theresa and Francis Stephen, who were simultaneously less inbred than recent Habsburg generations yet still carried enough concentrated genetics to exhibit the characteristic traits of their lineage. Their story demonstrated that even the most successful attempts to refresh royal bloodlines remained constrained by the limited genetic diversity available within the narrow circle of European nobility, ensuring that the biological consequences of royal breeding programs would continue to influence European history for generations to come. The Bourbon Connection, Louis XIV, Maria Theresa. In the golden embrace of dawn at Versailles, where mist rises from manicured gardens and fountains whisper secrets to statues of forgotten gods, the Sun King himself once walked arm in arm with his Spanish bride through galleries that reflected their images in endless multiplication, two cousins whose marriage would bind the fate of Europe's greatest monarchies, while concentrating bloodlines that had already been distilled through generations of careful royal breeding. Louis XIV of France and Maria Theresa of Spain represented the ultimate expression of Bourbon-Habsburg diplomatic calculation, a union designed to end centuries of warfare between their kingdoms, yet destined to create genetic combinations that would influence European royalty for generations to come. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 had concluded decades of warfare between France and Spain, with a marriage contract that read like a mathematical equation. Louis XIV, grandson of Marie de Medici and great-grandson of Philip II of Spain, would marry Maria Theresa, daughter of Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. The genealogical arithmetic revealed that bride and groom were double first cousins, their fathers were brothers. Their mothers were sisters, creating a genetic concentration that exceeded even the Habsburg family's usual standards of consanguinity. Maria Theresa's journey from Madrid to the French border for her wedding procession in 1660 represented more than diplomatic pageantry. It was the physical transfer of Spanish Habsburg genetics into French Bourbon bloodlines, creating combinations that neither dynasty had previously attempted. The young Infanta, barely 21 years old, carried in her veins the accumulated heritage of Spanish royal breeding that had produced both Charles V's imperial grandeur and the pathetic fragility of her half-brother, the future Charles II. Her pale complexion, characteristic Habsburg jaw, and episodes of what Spanish court physicians called melancholic humors provided visible evidence of her genetic inheritance. Louis XIV himself, despite his reputation for magnificent physical presence and inexhaustible energy, carried his own burden of concentrated royal genetics. Born to Louis XIII and Anne of Austria themselves, the products of careful Habsburg Bourbon breeding exhibited the psychological intensity and compulsive need for control that characterized many children of consanguineous royal marriages. His famous declaration, L'État, c'est moi, reflected not just political theory, but the kind of grandiose thinking that psychiatric historians recognize as common among individuals with certain genetic predispositions. The wedding ceremony at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, conducted with unprecedented magnificence that announced French cultural dominance to all Europe, masked the intimate genetic reality of this diplomatic triumph. Cardinal Mazarin, Louis's chief minister and the architect of this political masterstroke, had calculated the territorial and strategic advantages of the marriage with mathematical precision. Yet he possessed no understanding of the biological consequences that would unfold as these concentrated bloodlines combined in the royal nurseries of Versailles. The couple's early married life unfolded against the backdrop of Louis's transformation of Versailles from hunting lodge to the most magnificent palace in Europe. Maria Theresa found herself navigating not just the complex etiquette of French court life, but also the emotional challenge of marriage to a husband whose affections were increasingly divided among multiple mistresses. Her Spanish Habsburg training in stoic acceptance of royal marital arrangements served her well, yet court observers noted episodes of melancholy that suggested deeper psychological struggles with her position. Their reproductive relationship, documented in the clinical terms that court physicians used to discuss royal intimacies, reflected the complex interplay between political necessity and genetic compatibility. Maria Theresa conceived regularly during the early years of their marriage, yet their children's survival rates fell well below the standards that might be expected given the medical care available to French royalty. Court records, preserved in the archives at Versailles, document a heartbreaking series of pregnancies that ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death within months of delivery. Louis, the Dauphin, born in 1661 as the couple's first surviving child, embodied both the promise and the peril of Bourbon Habsburg genetics. Contemporary accounts describe him as an intelligent child who mastered his educational curriculum with ease, yet court physicians noted episodes of illness and behavioral patterns that suggested inherited vulnerabilities. His tendency toward obesity, despite the active lifestyle required of French royalty, may have reflected metabolic problems common among children of consanguineous marriages. His psychological development revealed the characteristic Bourbon intensity combined with Habsburg melancholy in proportions that would influence his personality throughout his life. The deaths of the couple's other children, Marie-Thérèse in 1672, Philippe in 1671, and Louis-François in 1672, created a pattern of infant mortality that exceeded statistical expectations even for 17th-century royalty. Court physicians attributed these losses to various causes ranging from weakness of constitution to excess of phlegmatic humors. Yet modern genetic analysis suggests that the concentrated bloodlines of both parents had created combinations incompatible with normal development and survival. Maria Theresa's own health deteriorated steadily throughout her childbearing years, manifesting symptoms that court physicians found difficult to categorize using 17th-century medical understanding. She suffered from chronic digestive problems, episodes of what contemporary accounts describe as nervous agitation, and periods of profound lethargy that required careful management by her attendants. Her Spanish confessor, in letters preserved in Habsburg archives, described a woman tormented by religious scruples that may have reflected the kind of obsessive-compulsive tendencies common among children of closely related parents. The Queen's death in 1683, at age 44, removed both a diplomatic symbol and a genetic influence that had been shaping the French royal line for over 2 decades. Her final illness, characterized by fever, delirium, and what court physicians described as putrid humors, followed patterns that modern medical historians recognize as consistent with immune system disorders that affect individuals with limited genetic diversity. Louis XIV's grief at her passing, while genuine, was tempered by relief that his marital obligations had ended and he could pursue the relationship with Madame de Maintenon that would dominate his later years. The surviving Dauphine carried forward the genetic legacy of his parents' union, eventually marrying Maria Anna Victoria of Bavaria in a union that introduced yet another layer of Habsburg genetics to French royal bloodlines. Their children, including the future Louis XV, would inherit the accumulated genetic burden of multiple royal breeding programs, creating combinations that would influence French monarchy through the reign of Louis XVI and the catastrophic final years of the Ancien Regime. Louis XIV's extramarital relationships, while scandalous to contemporary moralists, actually provided valuable genetic diversity that his legitimate children lacked. His numerous illegitimate offspring with mistresses drawn from French noble families carried Bourbon genetics that had been refreshed with bloodlines not subjected to the intensive breeding programs that characterized European royalty. These illegitimate lines would prove more robust and adaptable than their legitimate cousins, yet they remained forever excluded from succession rights by the rigid protocols that governed royal inheritance. The War of the Spanish Succession, triggered by the death of Charles II in 1700, represented the ultimate consequence of the genetic and political calculations that had governed the marriage of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa. Their son, the Dauphin's claim to the Spanish throne, inherited through his mother's Habsburg bloodlines, created a European crisis that would consume the continent in warfare for over a decade. The genetic connections forged through royal marriage had created political relationships that threatened to unite the French and Spanish crowns under a single dynasty. The eventual resolution of the succession crisis, which placed Louis XIV's grandson Philip V on the Spanish throne while renouncing French succession rights, demonstrated how genetic inheritance had become inseparable from international politics. The Peace of Utrecht in 1713 required not just territorial adjustments and trade agreements, but also genetic commitments, formal renunciations of inheritance rights based on bloodline calculations that affected the entire European balance of power. Louis XIV's death in 1715, after a reign of 72 years that had transformed both France and European civilization, marked the end of an era that had been shaped by the genetic consequences of his marriage to Maria Theresa. His great-grandson, Louis XV, who inherited the throne at age 5, carried forward the concentrated bloodlines created by centuries of royal breeding, yet faced challenges that would test whether genetic inheritance could adapt to the social and political changes transforming 18th century Europe. The marriage of Louis XIV and Maria Theresa ultimately demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of royal genetic engineering. Their union had achieved the diplomatic objectives that motivated it, ending warfare between France and Spain, while creating political relationships that would influence European history for generations. Yet it had also concentrated genetic traits in ways that would prove increasingly problematic as their descendants faced the biological and social challenges of modern monarchy, creating a legacy that would contribute to both the grandeur and the ultimate collapse of European royal power. Habsburg-Lorraine Echo, Emperor Ferdinand I. In the hushed corridors of the Hofburg Palace, where servants moved on silent feet and courtiers spoke in whispers that seemed to absorb into the ancient stones themselves, Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria lived a life that represented both the culmination and the tragic conclusion of the Habsburg genetic experiment. Born in 1793 as the eldest son of Emperor Francis II and Maria Theresa of Naples, Ferdinand embodied in his fragile person the accumulated consequences of centuries of strategic inbreeding that had concentrated not just royal bloodlines but also the genetic predispositions that would make normal life, much less effective rulership, virtually impossible. The circumstances of Ferdinand's birth had been attended by the kind of medical drama that had become routine in Habsburg deliveries, yet even experienced court physicians recognized that this child presented challenges beyond their normal expertise. The infant prince suffered from hydrocephalus, an abnormal accumulation of fluid in the brain that created a grotesquely enlarged head requiring specially designed bonnets to disguise the deformity during public appearances. His skull, soft and misshapen, needed constant protection from even minor impacts that might prove fatal to his underdeveloped brain. Francis II himself, Ferdinand's father, carried the genetic burden of multiple Habsburg breeding lines that had converged in his own parentage. The son of Leopold II and Maria Luisa of Spain, Francis represented the mathematical precision of royal genetics taken to its logical extremis. 8 great-grandparents included only 5 different individuals, with some ancestors appearing multiple times in his family tree. This genetic concentration, while preserving the theoretical purity of Habsburg bloodlines, had created combinations that expressed themselves in Ferdinand's profound disabilities. Maria Theresa of Naples, Ferdinand's mother, brought her own catalogue of concentrated genetics to their union. The daughter of Ferdinand I of the 2 Sicilies and Marie Caroline of Austria, she carried Habsburg bloodlines that had been circulating through Austrian and Spanish royal families for generations. Her own health problems, including chronic seizures and episodes of what court physicians termed nervous excitement, suggested genetic predispositions that would prove crucial in determining their children's development. Ferdinand's education proceeded with the careful adaptations required by his severe cognitive limitations, yet Habsburg court protocol demanded that the heir apparent receive training appropriate to his future responsibilities. Private tutors, sworn to absolute secrecy about their pupils' condition, developed teaching methods designed to work within the constraints imposed by Ferdinand's intellectual disabilities. Simple concepts required weeks of repetition, while complex ideas remained forever beyond his comprehension, creating an educational program that resembled therapy more than traditional royal instruction. The physical manifestations of Ferdinand's genetic inheritance extended far beyond his obvious cranial deformity. He suffered from severe epilepsy that triggered seizures lasting hours, during which his entire body would convulse, while foam gathered at his lips and court physicians applied the limited treatments available to 18th-century medicine. His speech, when intelligible at all, emerged as thick, slurred utterances that required interpretation by attendants who had learned to understand his particular patterns of communication. Court life adapted itself around Ferdinand's disabilities, with the elaborate protocols that characterized Habsburg administration. Special furniture was designed to accommodate his physical limitations, while modified court dress concealed the most obvious signs of his deformities. Meals required careful supervision, as Ferdinand's motor control problems made even basic eating a potential hazard requiring constant attention from specially trained servants who could prevent choking or other accidents. The question of Ferdinand's marriage became a delicate diplomatic challenge that required balancing dynastic necessity against humanitarian concerns about the wisdom of allowing his reproduction. European royal houses, despite their familiarity with genetic problems caused by inbreeding, found themselves confronting an unprecedented situation. An heir whose disabilities were so severe that marriage seemed both politically essential and biologically inadvisable. The genetic mathematics that governed royal breeding suddenly faced moral calculations that had never before seemed relevant. Maria Anna of Savoy, selected as Ferdinand's bride in 1831, brought both political advantages and personal courage to what everyone understood would be an extraordinary marriage. The daughter of Victor Emmanuel I of Sardinia, she carried Savoy bloodlines that had been concentrated through their own breeding programs, yet remained relatively free of the specific genetic combinations that had created Ferdinand's condition. Her education had prepared her for the responsibilities of queenship, yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of marriage to a husband whose cognitive age would never exceed that of a young child. Their wedding ceremony in Vienna, conducted with appropriate Habsburg magnificence, created the surreal spectacle of vows exchanged between a capable, intelligent woman and a man who could barely comprehend the meaning of the words he repeated. Court observers noted Maria Anna's composure during the ceremony, yet private correspondence preserved in Habsburg archives reveals her profound anxiety about the practical implications of her marriage to a husband who would require constant supervision and care. The couple's married life unfolded within the artificial environment of court protection that shielded Ferdinand from any situation that might expose his limitations to public view. Maria Anna, in addition to her ceremonial duties as empress, assumed the role of caregiver to a husband whose daily needs resembled those of a severely disabled child. Her letters to family members describe the patience required to manage Ferdinand's seizures, his episodes of violent agitation, and his complete dependence on others for even the most basic activities of daily living. Ferdinand's theoretical reign, which began in 1835 following his father's death, created unprecedented challenges for Austrian administration. The fiction that he actually ruled required elaborate governmental mechanisms designed to function without meaningful imperial input, while maintaining the appearance of traditional Habsburg authority. Chancellor Metternich and other senior officials developed what amounted to a shadow government that made all real decisions, while presenting them as imperial commands issued by an emperor who could barely understand the difference between his breakfast menu and matters of state. The revolution of 1848, which swept across Austria and threatened to destroy the Habsburg monarchy entirely, exposed the fundamental impossibility of Ferdinand's continued reign. Revolutionary crowds in Vienna demanded not just political reforms, but also an end to what they correctly perceived as government by proxy conducted in the name of an intellectually disabled emperor. The genetic experiment that had produced Ferdinand had finally created political consequences that threatened the dynasty's survival. Ferdinand's abdication in December 1848, orchestrated by his family and advisors rather than arising from any personal decision on his part, marked both the end of his nominal reign and the Habsburg dynasty's implicit admission that their breeding program had reached a genetic dead end. The transfer of the crown to his nephew Franz Joseph represented not just a change of ruler, but a tacit acknowledgement that centuries of strategic inbreeding had finally produced an heir so genetically compromised that even the elaborate fictions of imperial protocol could no longer maintain the pretense of effective rule. The remaining years of Ferdinand's life, spent in comfortable retirement at Prague Castle under the devoted care of Maria Anna, provided a peaceful conclusion to a existence that had been shaped entirely by genetic forces beyond his control or comprehension. He died in 1875, having outlived many of his more capable relatives. His longevity, perhaps the one genetic gift that had emerged from the concentrated bloodlines that had otherwise created only disability and suffering. Ferdinand I's life story served as both the culmination and the cautionary conclusion of the Habsburg genetic experiment, demonstrating how the mathematical precision of royal breeding could ultimately produce results that undermined the very foundations of monarchical authority. His reign, however fictional, marked the point at which European observers could no longer ignore the biological consequences of centuries of strategic inbreeding, setting the stage for the gradual abandonment of the marriage practices that had defined royal culture for over a millennium. Charles IV of Spain, Maria Luisa, first cousins twice over. In the labyrinthine corridors of the royal palace of Madrid, where shadows seemed to hold whispers of conspiracies and the very walls appeared to lean inward under the weight of centuries of accumulated secrets, King Charles IV of Spain and his Queen Maria Luisa of Parma enacted a royal marriage that represented the mathematical pinnacle of European genetic concentration. Their union, blessed by the Catholic Church and celebrated by Spanish nobility, involved first cousins who were related through not one but multiple genealogical pathways, creating a genetic combination so concentrated that their children would inherit identical DNA sequences from great-grandparents who appeared in their family tree through several different routes. The genealogical arithmetic of their relationship defied even the relaxed standards of 18th-century royal breeding. Charles IV, born in 1748 as the son of Charles III of Spain and Maria Amalia of Saxony, carried Bourbon bloodlines that had been circulating through Spanish and French royal families since the War of the Spanish Succession. Maria Louisa, daughter of Philip, Duke of Parma, and Princess Louise, Elizabeth of France, brought her own catalogue of concentrated Bourbon genetics. Yet the crucial factor was their shared descent from both Philip V of Spain and Elizabeth Farnese, making them first cousins through their fathers and first cousins again through their mothers. A double relationship that created genetic concentrations unprecedented, even in the annals of European royal inbreeding. Charles himself embodied the physical and psychological consequences of this genetic heritage in ways that made his eventual unfitness for kingship apparent to even casual observers. Court portraits, executed with the diplomatic artistry required for royal commissions, could not entirely disguise his prominent Bourbon nose, weak chin, and the peculiar combination of features that suggested both intellectual limitation and emotional instability. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man whose interests never progressed beyond hunting and mechanical toys, whose attention span could barely encompass the reading of brief state papers, and whose decision-making process seemed to operate according to principles that defied rational analysis. Maria Luisa brought to their marriage not just her own genetic burden, but also a forceful personality that would prove crucial in managing both her husband's limitations and the complex political challenges facing late 18th century Spain. Born in 1751, she had been raised in the sophisticated court environment of Parma, where her parents had maintained one of Italy's most cultured royal households. Her education included training in languages, music, and statecraft that far exceeded anything Charles had absorbed during his own desultory preparation for kingship, creating a marriage dynamic where intellectual capacity was inversely related to formal political authority. Their wedding in 1765, celebrated with the elaborate ceremonial that characterized Spanish royal occasions, united two teenagers whose combined genetic inheritance represented the culmination of centuries of careful Bourbon breeding. The 14-year-old bride and 17-year-old groom exchanged vows in the magnificent throne room of the royal palace. Surrounded by courtiers who understood the political significance of their union, yet possessed no comprehension of the biological experiment they were witnessing. Cardinal Lorenzana, who conducted the ceremony, offered prayers for the couple's fertility that would prove grimly prophetic, given the tragic fate of many of their children. The early years of their marriage unfolded during the reign of Charles III, when the young couple lived as heirs apparent in the artificial environment of court protection that shielded them from both public scrutiny and practical responsibility. Charles IV's intellectual limitations became increasingly apparent as he matured, manifesting in an inability to grasp complex political concepts and a tendency toward the kind of impulsive decision-making that characterized many individuals with genetic predispositions toward cognitive impairment. His passion for hunting, while politically useful as a public display of royal vigor, also served the practical function of providing an activity suited to his intellectual capacity. Maria Luisa's growing influence over her husband reflected not just personal dominance but practical necessity, as court observers recognized that effective governance required someone capable of understanding the documents that Charles could barely read, much less comprehend. Her correspondence with family members in Parma, preserved in Italian archives, reveals a woman who understood her husband's limitations, yet remained committed to maintaining the dignity of their position and the stability of their eventual reign. She developed strategies for managing Charles's public appearances that concealed his intellectual deficiencies, while allowing her to exercise the authority that his incapacity made impossible. Their reproductive relationship produced 14 children over 23 years, yet this apparent fertility masked the genetic crisis that their double-cousin marriage had created. Infant mortality among their offspring exceeded even the high rates common to 18th-century royal families, with several children dying within months of birth from what court physicians described as constitutional weakness or failure to thrive. Those children who survived infancy often exhibited developmental delays, physical abnormalities, or behavioral problems that required constant medical attention and careful management by court staff trained in dealing with royal genetic issues. The most dramatic manifestation of their genetic inheritance appeared in their son Ferdinand, born in 1784, who would eventually rule as Ferdinand VII, but whose physical and psychological characteristics reflected the accumulated burden of Bourbon inbreeding. Contemporary accounts describe him as a child of normal intelligence, yet marked by the characteristic Bourbon features taken to an extreme: enormously prominent nose, weak jaw, and stocky build that made him appear prematurely aged even in childhood. His personality development revealed patterns of cruelty and paranoia that would later make him one of the most despised rulers in Spanish history. The political crisis that would define Charles IV's reign began to unfold in the 1790s as revolutionary France exported both political ideas and military pressure that challenged the foundations of European monarchy. Charles's intellectual limitations, previously masked by the peaceful prosperity of his father's final years, became dangerously apparent as Spain faced challenges requiring sophisticated political judgment and decisive leadership. His inability to understand the implications of French revolutionary ideology, combined with his tendency toward panic in crisis situations, created opportunities for ambitious courtiers to exploit royal weakness for personal advantage. Maria Luisa's relationship with Manuel Godoy, the handsome young guardsman who rose to become Spain's chief minister, represented both a personal scandal and a practical solution to the problem of governing a kingdom whose king lacked the capacity for effective rule. Their affair, conducted with barely concealed publicity that shocked even the sophisticated Spanish court, provided Maria Luisa with a partner capable of understanding and implementing the complex policies required to navigate European diplomatic crises. Godoy's rise from provincial obscurity to virtual control of Spanish government reflected not just royal favoritism, but the desperate need for competent leadership that Charles's genetic inheritance had made impossible. The question of paternity that surrounded several of Maria Luisa's later children added dynastic uncertainty to the political chaos of Charles's reign. Court observers noted that some royal offspring bore striking resemblances to Godoy rather than the king, creating succession questions that would plague Spanish politics for generations. The genetic mathematics that had governed royal breeding for centuries suddenly faced challenges from unauthorized genetic contributions that threatened to disrupt carefully calculated bloodline concentrations. Napoleon Bonaparte's manipulation of Spanish royal weakness during the early 1800s demonstrated how genetic factors could create political vulnerabilities that ambitious foreign powers might exploit. The French emperor recognized that Charles's intellectual limitations and the royal family's dependence on Godoy created opportunities for French influence that would have been impossible with more capable Spanish leadership. The treaties of San Ildefonso and Aranjuez, which essentially subordinated Spanish foreign policy to French interests, reflected not just diplomatic pressure, but also the practical reality that Spanish royal genetics had produced leaders incapable of independent judgment. The tumult of Aranjuez in 1808, which forced Charles IV's abdication in favor of his son Ferdinand, marked the collapse of Bourbon rule in Spain and demonstrated how genetic factors had undermined the dynasty's ability to maintain effective government. The royal family's public humiliation, as they were essentially kidnapped by Napoleon and forced to transfer their rights to French nominees, reflected the ultimate consequences of a breeding program that had prioritized genetic concentration over practical capability. Charles IV's death in exile in 1819, far from the Spanish territories his ancestors had ruled for over a century, marked the end of a reign that had demonstrated the catastrophic political consequences that could result when royal genetics reached the point of producing rulers fundamentally unfit for their responsibilities. His marriage to Maria Luisa, while representing the mathematical perfection of Bourbon breeding programs, had created genetic combinations that ultimately contributed to the dynasty's downfall and Spain's descent into political chaos that would characterize much of the 19th century. Queen Victoria's hemophilic shadow. In the rose gardens of Windsor Castle, where morning dew catches the first light and ancient oaks cast protective shadows over manicured lawns, a tiny genetic mutation carried in the blood of a young queen would spread across the royal houses of Europe like ripples from a stone dropped into still water, transforming the careful breeding programs of monarchical dynasties into laboratories for studying one of history's most devastating hereditary diseases. Queen Victoria of Britain, whose reign would define an era and whose descendants would occupy thrones from London to St. Petersburg, carried within her bloodstream a spontaneous genetic alteration that would prove more destructive to European royalty than any army or revolution. The mutation that created Victoria's carrier status for haemophilia remains one of genetics' most intriguing mysteries, as neither her parents nor any known ancestors had exhibited symptoms of the bleeding disorder that would plague her descendants for generations. King George III's occasional episodes of unusual bleeding, which some historians have suggested might indicate haemophilia in the Hanoverian line, provide the only possible ancestral connection, yet the genetic evidence suggests that Victoria's haemophilia gene represented a spontaneous mutation, a random alteration in her DNA that transformed her from merely another German princess into the unwitting architect of a genetic catastrophe. Victoria herself never exhibited symptoms of haemophilia, as the disease typically affects males while females serve as asymptomatic carriers, but the genetic roulette wheel that governed her reproductive life meant that each pregnancy carried a 50% chance of passing the defective gene to her children. Her marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840 appeared to offer the promise of genetic refreshment, as Albert's ancestry had developed independently of the British royal line, yet their union would prove to be the mechanism through which haemophilia spread across European royalty rather than the solution to Britain's genetic challenges. The couple's extraordinary fertility, 9 children born over 17 years initially, seemed to vindicate the wisdom of their marriage and suggest that British royal genetics were healthier than the concentrated bloodlines that produced such catastrophic results in Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties. Victoria and Albert's children included future emperors, kings, and queens who would carry British genetic material into royal houses across Europe. Yet this apparent genetic diversity masked the hidden presence of the haemophilia mutation that would manifest in subsequent generations with devastating consequences. Leopold, their 8th child and youngest son, born in 1853, became the first visible manifestation of Victoria's genetic burden when his tendency toward prolonged bleeding after minor injuries revealed the presence of haemophilia in the British royal line. Court physicians, working with the limited medical understanding of the Victorian era, could only observe and document a condition they couldn't explain or treat effectively. Leopold's childhood became a carefully managed sequence of protective measures designed to prevent the injuries that might trigger potentially fatal bleeding episodes. The psychological impact of Leopold's condition on Victoria and Albert reflected the emotional challenges faced by parents who must watch their children suffer from genetic conditions beyond medical intervention. Victoria's correspondence from this period reveals a woman tormented by guilt over her role in transmitting the disease, while Albert's scientific interests led him to consult with leading physicians about hereditary illness in ways that prefigured modern genetic counseling. Their attempts to balance Leopold's need for protection with his desire for normal royal activities created precedents for managing genetic disease within royal families. Victoria's daughters, while appearing healthy themselves, carried the hidden genetic burden that would prove crucial in spreading haemophilia across European royalty. Alice, who married Louis IV of Hesse, introduced the mutation into German noble bloodlines through her children, including Alexandra, who would later become Tsarina of Russia. Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter, carried haemophilia genes into the Spanish royal family through her marriage to Prince Henry of Battenberg, creating genetic combinations that would affect Spanish succession for generations. The marriage diplomacy that characterized Victoria's approach to her children's unions, while politically successful in creating networks of British influence across European courts, inadvertently transformed her genetic legacy into a continental crisis. Her policy of arranging marriages between her descendants and other European royalty meant that the haemophilia gene would be introduced into precisely those bloodlines where its effects would prove most politically destabilizing. The careful breeding programs that had governed European royalty for centuries suddenly faced disruption from a genetic factor that no amount of genealogical planning could predict or control. Alexandra of Hesse, Victoria's granddaughter, carried the hemophilia gene into the Romanov dynasty through her marriage to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, creating the medical crisis that would contribute to the collapse of the Russian monarchy. Their son Alexei, heir to the Romanov throne, inherited both the crown and the bleeding disorder that made normal childhood impossible and effective future rulership questionable. The Tsarevich's condition, requiring constant medical supervision and creating opportunities for charlatans like Rasputin to gain influence over imperial decision-making, demonstrated how genetic factors could destabilize entire political systems. The irony of Victoria's genetic legacy was that her conscious attempts to strengthen British influence through strategic marriages had actually weakened the European royal system by introducing a medical factor that no political calculation could accommodate. Courts that had spent centuries perfecting the mathematics of bloodline concentration suddenly found themselves confronting a genetic wildcard that could affect any pregnancy regardless of careful genealogical planning. The hemophilia gene represented nature's revenge against artificial breeding programs that had attempted to control human genetics through political arrangements. Spain's royal family suffered its own hemophilia crisis through the marriage of Victoria's granddaughter, Victoria Eugenie, to King Alfonso XIII, introducing British genetic material into Spanish Bourbon bloodlines that had already been weakened by centuries of consanguineous marriage. Their sons, including the heir apparent Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, inherited hemophilia symptoms that made traditional royal activities dangerous and succession planning uncertain. The Spanish royal family's attempts to conceal their genetic problems from public knowledge created additional political vulnerabilities that Republican movements could exploit. Germany's royal houses experienced similar genetic disruption as Victoria's descendants married into Prussian and other German noble families, spreading hemophilia genes throughout the complex network of princely states that comprised the German Empire. The Battenberg family, despite their morganatic status, carried Victoria's genetic legacy into multiple European bloodlines through marriages that introduced British hemophilia genes into previously unaffected noble families. World War I would eliminate many German royal houses, yet those that survived into the 20th century often carried the genetic burden that Victoria's fertility had distributed across the continent. The scientific understanding of hemophilia that emerged during the late 19th and early 20th centuries gradually revealed the mechanism through which Victoria's genetic legacy had spread across European royalty. Medical researchers studying royal family trees discovered patterns of inheritance that confirmed hemophilia's sex-linked recessive nature, while court physicians developed treatment protocols designed to manage bleeding episodes in royal patients whose conditions required absolute secrecy to avoid political embarrassment. Victoria's death in 1901, after a reign of 63 years that had transformed both Britain and European civilization, marked the end of an era that had been defined by genetic factors no one could have anticipated when she ascended the throne as an 18-year-old girl. Her enormous extended family, numbering in the dozens and occupying thrones across Europe, carried forward not just British political influence, but also the hemophilia gene that would continue to affect European royalty through World War I and beyond. The ultimate tragedy of Victoria's genetic legacy was that her conscious efforts to create a peaceful Europe through family connections had instead introduced a destabilizing factor that contributed to the political crises that would destroy the monarchical system she had worked to strengthen. The hemophilia gene, spread through her well-intentioned marriage diplomacy, became a symbol of the vulnerability that even the most powerful royal families faced when confronted with genetic forces beyond their control or comprehension, demonstrating that nature's random mutations could prove more destructive to dynastic stability than any human enemy. The Romanov ripple, Nicholas II, Alexandra. In the ethereal light of a Russian winter morning, where snow transforms the Alexander Palace into a crystalline fortress, and the silence seems to muffle even whispered prayers, Tsar Nicholas II knelt beside the bed of his young son Alexei, watching helplessly as the boy's life slowly drained away through internal bleeding that no imperial physician could stop. The hemophilia that coursed through the Tsarevich's veins carried more than genetic instructions for a clotting disorder. It bore the accumulated weight of European royal breeding programs that had finally converged in a single child, whose medical crises would destabilize an empire and contribute to the collapse of a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. The marriage of Nicholas II and Alexandra of Hesse in 1894 had appeared to offer hope for genetic renewal in the Romanov bloodline, as Alexandra's German ancestry provided bloodlines that had not been extensively mixed with Russian royal genetics. Yet their union represented the intersection of multiple European breeding programs that had been concentrating royal bloodlines for generations, creating genetic combinations that would prove both politically and medically catastrophic. Nicholas carried the accumulated heritage of Romanov marriages that had carefully maintained dynastic purity, while Alexandra brought the haemophilia gene inherited from her grandmother Queen Victoria, creating a genetic time bomb that would explode in the nurseries of the Russian imperial family. Nicholas himself embodied the complex inheritance patterns that had shaped Romanov genetics for centuries. Born in 1868 as the product of careful royal breeding that had preserved both the dynasty's legitimacy and its accumulated genetic vulnerabilities. His father, Alexander III, had been a giant of a man whose physical strength masked psychological insecurities that manifested in paranoid authoritarianism, while his mother, Marie Feodorovna, carried Danish royal bloodlines that had been concentrated through generations of strategic marriage within the narrow circle of Protestant European royalty. Nicholas inherited his father's tendency toward indecision under pressure and his mother's emotional sensitivity, creating a personality ill-suited for the autocratic leadership that Russian political traditions demanded. Alexandra brought to their marriage not just her grandmother's haemophilia gene, but also the religious intensity and emotional volatility that characterized many children of the concentrated German noble bloodlines. Born as Princess Alex of Hesse, and by Rhine in 1872, she had been raised in the sophisticated court environment of Darmstadt, where her parents had maintained one of Germany's most culturally refined royal households. Her education included training in languages, music, and the elaborate social protocols that governed European royal life. Yet it also emphasized the kind of mystical religious devotion that would later make her susceptible to spiritual charlatans who promised miraculous cures for her son's genetic disease. Their courtship and marriage unfolded against the backdrop of European diplomatic tensions that would culminate in World War I. Yet, the personal dimension of their relationship revealed 2 young people genuinely devoted to each other, despite the political calculations that had brought them together. Their correspondence, preserved in Russian archives and published after the revolution, documents a love affair that transcended the arranged nature of their union. Yet it also reveals psychological patterns that suggested inherited predispositions toward anxiety, depression, and the kind of obsessive religious devotion that would characterize their approach to both personal relationships and imperial governance. The early years of their marriage produced 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, who appeared healthy and normal, yet each pregnancy had carried the genetic roulette of haemophilia transmission that made the imperial couple increasingly desperate for a male heir who might escape Alexandra's genetic burden. The Russian succession law required a male heir to inherit the throne, creating political pressure that transformed each pregnancy into a matter of dynastic survival. The birth of each daughter, while celebrated publicly, privately represented another failure to produce the genetically sound male heir that Russian political stability required. Alexei's birth in 1904, after 10 years of marriage and 4 daughters, initially seemed to answer the imperial couple's prayers and secure the Romanov succession for another generation. The Tsarevich appeared healthy at birth, showing no immediate signs of the bleeding disorder that would soon transform his childhood into a series of medical crises requiring constant vigilance and intervention. Court physicians, unaware of the genetic factors that would soon manifest, conducted the traditional ceremonies celebrating the birth of a male heir, while Nicholas and Alexandra enjoyed a brief period of optimism about their family's future and their dynasty's genetic health. The first manifestation of Alexei's haemophilia, appearing when he was several months old in the form of prolonged bleeding from minor injuries, shattered the imperial family's hopes and created medical challenges that would define the remainder of Nicholas II's reign. Court physicians, working with the limited understanding of early 20th century medicine, could only observe and document a condition they could neither explain nor treat effectively. The Tsarevich's bleeding episodes, triggered by the normal bumps and bruises of childhood, required elaborate protective measures that isolated him from normal activities while creating an atmosphere of perpetual medical emergency within the imperial household. Alexandra's response to her son's condition reflected both maternal devotion and the psychological inheritance that had shaped her personality since childhood. Her desperate search for medical treatments led her into increasingly mystical territory, as conventional physicians proved helpless against a genetic condition that no amount of imperial wealth or authority could cure. Her correspondence from this period reveals a woman tormented by guilt over her role in transmitting the disease, while her increasing reliance on prayer and spiritual healing demonstrated the kind of obsessive religious behavior that characterized many individuals with genetic predispositions toward anxiety disorders. The political consequences of the Tsarevich's condition extended far beyond the imperial family's private suffering, as Alexei's medical crises created opportunities for manipulation by individuals who claimed healing powers. Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian peasant whose apparent ability to stop the boy's bleeding episodes gave him unprecedented influence over imperial decision-making, represented the most dramatic example of how genetic factors could destabilize entire political systems. Rasputin's presence at court, widely resented by Russian nobility and used by revolutionary propagandists to discredit the monarchy, demonstrated how medical necessity could override political wisdom when genetic diseases affected ruling families. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 tested the Romanov dynasty's ability to maintain effective leadership while managing the medical crisis that Alexei's condition created within the imperial family. Nicholas II's decision to assume personal command of Russian military forces, while politically motivated by his belief in autocratic responsibility, also reflected his desire to escape the domestic pressures created by his son's illness and his wife's increasing dependence on mystical healers. The Tsar's absence from St. Petersburg left Alexandra effectively in control of domestic policy, creating unprecedented opportunities for her genetic and psychological predispositions to influence Russian governance. Alexandra's regency during Nicholas's military campaigns revealed how genetic factors could affect not just individual health but entire political systems when inherited traits influenced decision-making at the highest levels of government. Her correspondence with government ministers, preserved in Russian state archives, documents decision-making processes that reflected both her genuine concern for Russian welfare and psychological patterns that suggested inherited predispositions toward paranoid thinking and impulsive judgment. Her reliance on Rasputin's advice for both medical and political matters created policy directions that often contradicted rational analysis and contributed to the growing crisis of confidence that would culminate in revolution. The February Revolution of 1917, which forced Nicholas II's abdication and ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule, resulted from multiple factors including military defeats, economic collapse, and social unrest. Yet the genetic crisis within the imperial family had contributed to the political instability that made revolution possible. The Tsar's perceived weakness, partly attributed to his inability to control his wife's dependence on mystical healers, had undermined confidence in monarchical institutions while creating opportunities for revolutionary movements to exploit popular resentment against royal incompetence. The imprisonment and eventual execution of the imperial family at Ekaterinburg in 1918 marked the tragic conclusion of a genetic experiment that had produced both unprecedented wealth and political power, yet had ultimately created vulnerabilities that proved incompatible with the demands of modern governance. Alexei's haemophilia, the direct result of Queen Victoria's genetic legacy combined with the concentrated bloodlines of European royal breeding programs, had contributed to political decisions that destabilized not just the Russian Empire, but the entire European balance of power. The bodies of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children, discovered and identified through DNA analysis in the 1990s, provided final confirmation of the genetic factors that had shaped their lives and contributed to their deaths. Scientific analysis of their remains revealed not just the hemophilia gene that had plagued Alexei, but also other genetic markers that reflected the concentrated bloodlines of European royalty, demonstrating how centuries of careful breeding had created combinations that proved both politically and biologically unsustainable when confronted with the challenges of the modern world. Bourbon, Two Sicilies, Francis II. In the golden twilight that bathes the Bay of Naples, where Vesuvius broods over ancient waters and the songs of fishermen echo across waves that have carried the dreams and disappointments of countless generations, King Francis II of the Two Sicilies lived out the final chapter of a Bourbon dynasty whose genetic heritage had concentrated through centuries of careful breeding into a royal line that produced rulers increasingly unfit for the demands of 19th-century monarchy. The last of the Bourbon kings of Naples, Francis embodied in his person the accumulated consequences of strategic inbreeding that had preserved dynastic legitimacy while creating physical and psychological vulnerabilities that would prove no match for the revolutionary forces, reshaping the Italian peninsula. The genealogical foundation of Francis's genetic burden stretched back through multiple generations of Bourbon marriages that had systematically concentrated Spanish, French, and Italian royal bloodlines within a single family tree. His father, Ferdinand II, had been the product of a marriage between first cousins who shared Bourbon ancestors through both Spanish and French branches of the family, while his mother, Maria Theresa of Austria, carried Habsburg genetics that had been circulating through European royal houses for centuries. Francis thus inherited the concentrated essence of three major royal breeding programs, creating genetic combinations that had never before existed in human history. Born in 1836 in the magnificent royal palace of Naples, with its sweeping views of the Mediterranean and its chambers decorated with frescoes celebrating Bourbon military victories that already belonged to a vanishing past, Francis entered a world where his family's genetic inheritance was becoming increasingly apparent in the physical and mental characteristics of royal family members. Court physicians documented a pattern of health problems among Bourbon Two Sicilies royalty that included chronic deafness, developmental delays, and reproductive difficulties that threatened the dynasty's ability to maintain effective succession from generation to generation. Francis himself exhibited the characteristic features that had become associated with concentrated Bourbon bloodlines: a prominent nose that dominated his narrow face, weak jaw that affected both his appearance and his ability to speak clearly, and the stocky build that made him appear prematurely aged even in childhood. More significantly, he suffered from severe hearing loss that began in early childhood and progressively worsened throughout his life, creating communication difficulties that would prove politically catastrophic when he needed to maintain public support during the crisis years of his reign. His education proceeded with the adaptations required by his hearing impairment, yet the elaborate court protocols of Bourbon Two Sicilies monarchy demanded that the heir apparent receive training appropriate to his future responsibilities as both temporal ruler and defender of Catholic faith in southern Italy. Private tutors developed teaching methods designed to work within the constraints imposed by Francis's genetic inheritance, yet they struggled to prepare him for the complex political challenges that Italian unification would bring to his kingdom. The question of Francis's marriage became a delicate diplomatic challenge that required balancing dynastic necessity against the practical limitations imposed by his genetic inheritance. European royal houses, despite their familiarity with genetic problems caused by inbreeding, found themselves confronting a situation where the heir to a strategically important throne possessed disabilities that might compromise his effectiveness as both husband and ruler. The genetic mathematics that had governed royal breeding for centuries suddenly faced practical calculations about reproductive viability and political competence. Maria Sophia of Bavaria, selected as Francis's bride in 1859, brought both political advantages and personal courage to what everyone understood would be a challenging marriage. The daughter of Maximilian Joseph, Duke in Bavaria, She carried Wittelsbach bloodlines that had been concentrated through their own breeding programs, yet remained relatively free of the specific genetic combinations that had created Francis's most severe disabilities. Her education had prepared her for the responsibilities of queenship, yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of marriage to a husband whose hearing loss made normal communication nearly impossible and whose other genetic inheritance created additional challenges for their relationship. Their wedding in Munich, conducted with appropriate Bavarian ceremony before their departure for Naples, united two young people whose genetic inheritance represented the culmination of centuries of European royal breeding. The political significance of their union, designed to strengthen Catholic monarchy in Italy against liberal and nationalist challenges, created expectations that their personal relationship would struggle to fulfill, given the practical difficulties imposed by Francis's disabilities and the concentrated bloodlines both brought to their marriage. The early months of their marriage unfolded as Giuseppe Garibaldi's revolutionary army advanced northward through Sicily and Calabria, threatening to destroy the Bourbon kingdom that Francis had inherited only months before his wedding. The military crisis that would define his brief reign required precisely the kind of decisive leadership and effective communication that his genetic inheritance had made impossible, creating a tragic situation where political necessity demanded capabilities that hereditary factors had eliminated. Francis's attempts to rally popular support against Garibaldi's invasion were hampered by his inability to communicate effectively with either his military commanders or his subjects, as his severe hearing loss made normal conversation nearly impossible, while his speech patterns, affected by the same genetic factors that had created his deafness, were difficult for others to understand. The psychological pressure of defending his kingdom against revolutionary forces triggered episodes of what court physicians described as nervous exhaustion, suggesting inherited predispositions toward anxiety disorders that made effective crisis management impossible. The Siege of Gaeta, where Francis and Maria Sofia made their final stand against the forces of Italian unification, became a symbol of both Bourbon courage and the tragic consequences of genetic inheritance that had created rulers unfit for the demands of modern warfare. The young royal couple, isolated in their coastal fortress while Piedmontese artillery systematically destroyed their defenses, demonstrated personal bravery that earned respect even from their enemies. Yet their resistance could not overcome the fundamental political reality that genetic factors had produced leadership inadequate for 19th-century challenges. Maria Sofia's transformation during the siege, from sheltered Bavarian princess to warrior queen defending the ramparts of Gaeta, provided a dramatic contrast to her husband's increasing withdrawal into the kind of passive resignation that characterized many individuals with severe genetic burdens. Her correspondence from this period, preserved in Bavarian archives, describes a woman who had assumed responsibilities that her husband's genetic inheritance made impossible for him to fulfill, yet who remained devoted to both their marriage and their lost cause, despite the hopelessness of their situation. The fall of Gaeta in February 1861 marked not just the end of Francis II's reign, but the collapse of the last independent Bourbon kingdom in Italy, demonstrating how genetic factors had contributed to political vulnerabilities that revolutionary movements could exploit. The royal couple's departure into exile, sailing from their conquered fortress toward an uncertain future in papal Rome, symbolized the broader failure of European royal breeding programs to produce leaders capable of adapting to the social and political changes transforming 19th-century Europe. Francis's remaining years, spent in comfortable exile under papal protection, while Italian unification proceeded without interference from the deposed Bourbon king, provided a peaceful but melancholy conclusion to a reign that had demonstrated the tragic consequences of genetic inheritance, unchecked by practical considerations. His death in 1894, 33 years after losing his throne, marked the end of a royal line that had achieved the mathematical perfection of bloodline concentration, yet had ultimately created rulers whose genetic burden made effective governance impossible in an era that demanded adaptability rather than hereditary legitimacy. The Bourbon II Sicilies experiment in royal genetics, reaching its conclusion in Francis II's brief and tragic reign, served as a cautionary example of how the careful breeding programs that had sustained European monarchy for centuries could ultimately produce results that undermined the very foundations of royal authority. His marriage to Maria Sophia, while personally happy despite their genetic challenges, had been unable to produce the heirs who might have continued their dynasty, as their concentrated bloodlines proved incompatible with successful reproduction, the final judgment on centuries of strategic inbreeding that had prioritized political calculation over biological wisdom. SAXE-COBURG cousins, the grandchildren marriages. In the amber glow of gaslight that illuminated the drawing rooms of European palaces during the final decades of the 19th century, where telegraph wires carried news of distant revolutions and railway schedules connected courts that had once seemed worlds apart, Queen Victoria's grandchildren gathered for weddings that would transform the continent's royal families from separate dynasties into branches of a single enormous family tree. These marriages, orchestrated with the precision of diplomatic treaties and celebrated with the pageantry that marked the zenith of European monarchy, represented the ultimate expression of Victoria's marriage diplomacia, systematic program of genetic distribution that would bind together the royal houses of England, Germany, Russia, and lesser kingdoms in relationships so complex that the outbreak of World War I would literally become a family quarrel fought between cousins who shared common ancestors and similar genetic vulnerabilities. The mathematical precision of these interconnected marriages defied even the sophisticated genealogical calculations that had governed European royal breeding for centuries. Victoria's 9 children had married into royal houses across the continent, carrying British genetic material into bloodlines that had previously developed independently. Yet this apparent genetic diversification actually created new forms of concentration, as cousins married cousins through multiple pathways that made traditional kinship calculations obsolete. The result was a generation of European royalty who were simultaneously related through their grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, creating genetic combinations that nature had never intended and that science was only beginning to understand. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Victoria's eldest grandson through her daughter Vicky, embodied both the achievements and the catastrophic vulnerabilities of this genetic experiment. Born in 1859 with a withered left arm resulting from birth trauma that may have been related to his mother's own genetic predispositions, Wilhelm grew up in the artificial environment of Prussian court protocol that required concealing any sign of physical weakness while preparing him for leadership of Europe's most militaristic society. His psychological development revealed the complex inheritance patterns that characterized Victoria's descendants: intellectual brilliance combined with emotional instability, grandiose thinking that approached megalomania, and the kind of impulsive decision-making that would ultimately trigger the catastrophe of 1914. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, married to Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra, represented another node in this network of genetic concentration that had created ruling families whose personal relationships would prove incapable of preventing political disaster. Their marriage, while personally happy, had concentrated British, German, and Russian royal bloodlines in combinations that produced both the haemophilia crisis that destabilized their regime and the psychological vulnerabilities that made effective response to revolutionary challenges impossible. The irony that Nicholas and Wilhelm were cousins who addressed each other as Nicky and Willie in their personal correspondence would acquire tragic dimensions when their nations went to war in 1914. King George V of England, Victoria's grandson through her son Edward VII, brought yet another strand of genetic concentration to this royal web through his marriage to Mary of Teck, herself a descendant of George III, through multiple pathways that made their union another example of the cousin marriages that had become standard practice among European royalty. Their children would inherit not just the British throne but also genetic predispositions that reflected centuries of careful breeding designed to preserve royal characteristics while concentrating the very traits that would make adaptation to 20th century challenges increasingly difficult. The German royal houses provided the most complex examples of this genetic interconnection, as Victoria's descendants married into the labyrinthine network of princely families that comprised the German Empire. The marriage of Victoria's granddaughter Sophie to Crown Prince Constantine of Greece created another pathway for British genetic material to enter bloodlines that had already been concentrated through generations of strategic breeding within the narrow circle of Protestant German nobility. Their children would inherit titles and territories across multiple kingdoms while carrying genetic burdens that reflected the accumulated consequences of European royal breeding programs. Romania's royal family experienced similar genetic concentration through the marriage of Victoria's granddaughter Marie to Crown Prince Ferdinand, creating combinations of British, German, and Romanian royal bloodlines that would influence Balkan politics for generations. Marie's personality, combining the artistic sensibilities characteristic of Victoria's descendants with the emotional volatility that marked many children of consanguineous marriages, demonstrated how genetic factors could affect not just individual health, but entire political systems when inherited traits influenced decision-making at the highest levels of government. The photographic evidence of these interconnected royal relationships, preserved in albums that document family gatherings spanning decades, reveals both the personal affection that characterized many of these cousin marriages and the subtle signs of genetic stress that affected Victoria's descendants across multiple generations. Family portraits from Balmoral, Osborne House, and various German castles show children and grandchildren who possessed the refined features associated with royal breeding, yet also exhibited the pale complexions, delicate builds, and other physical characteristics that suggested underlying genetic vulnerabilities. The medical records of Victoria's grandchildren, scattered across European archives and often encoded in the diplomatic language that court physicians use to discuss royal health problems, document patterns of illness and disability that exceeded statistical expectations even for the limited medical knowledge of the era. Chronic conditions including digestive problems, nervous disorders, and reproductive difficulties appeared with unusual frequency among Victoria's descendants, suggesting that her genetic legacy included more than just the haemophilia gene that had received most historical attention. World War I represented the ultimate test of whether the personal relationships created by Victoria's marriage diplomacy could override the political pressures that drove European nations toward conflict. The correspondence between Wilhelm II and Nicholas II during the July crisis of 1914, preserved in German and Russian archives, documents two cousins who understood the genetic and personal connections that bound their families, yet proved incapable of preventing the war that would destroy the monarchical system they had inherited from their common grandmother. The war's conduct revealed how genetic factors had affected the personalities of Europe's royal leaders in ways that influenced their political and military decision-making. Wilhelm's grandiose strategic thinking and inability to accept advice that contradicted his preconceptions reflected psychological patterns that psychiatric historians recognize as common among individuals with certain genetic predispositions. Nicholas's tendency toward indecision and emotional volatility, while partly attributable to the stress of his son's haemophilia, also suggested inherited traits that made effective wartime leadership nearly impossible. The collapse of European monarchy during and after World War I marked the end of the system that had created Victoria's grandchildren, marriages, and demonstrated the ultimate failure of genetic concentration to produce leaders capable of adapting to modern challenges. The German Empire, Russian Empire, and Austro-Hungarian Empire all disappeared, taking with them royal houses whose genetic inheritance had proved incompatible with the demands of 20th century governance. The surviving monarchies, Britain, Belgium, and the Scandinavian kingdoms, would be forced to abandon the intensive breeding programs that had characterized European royalty for centuries. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918–1919, which killed millions across Europe, proved particularly devastating to royal families whose genetic concentration had created immune system vulnerabilities that made them especially susceptible to infectious diseases. Several of Victoria's descendants died during the pandemic, including children and grandchildren, whose concentrated bloodlines provided little resistance to pathogens that more genetically diverse populations might survive. The pandemic served as nature's final judgment on centuries of royal breeding programs that had prioritized political calculation over biological wisdom. The survivors among Victoria's grandchildren faced the challenge of adapting to a world where genetic concentration was no longer politically viable and where democratic movements demanded leaders chosen for competence rather than hereditary legitimacy. Those royal houses that survived into the modern era would be forced to abandon the marriage practices that had defined European monarchy for centuries, seeking genetic diversity through unions with commoners who could provide the biological refreshment that centuries of cousin marriage had eliminated from royal bloodlines. The legacy of Victoria's grandchildren marriages extends beyond their immediate political consequences to include the scientific understanding of genetics that emerged from studying their family trees. Medical researchers analyzing the inheritance patterns of hemophilia, porphyria, and other genetic conditions within European royal families contributed to the development of modern genetics, while demonstrating how mathematical breeding programs could produce predictable yet catastrophic results when applied to human reproduction. Their tragic example served as both scientific data and moral warning about the dangers of prioritizing political advantage over biological diversity. Windsor wins. George V, Mary of Teck. In the quiet hours before dawn at Windsor Castle, when mist rises from the Thames and the ancient stones seem to whisper secrets of centuries past, King George V would often walk alone through the corridors where his grandmother Victoria's portraits gazed down with the stern approval of a dynasty that had survived revolution, war, and the kind of political upheavals that had swept away less adaptable royal houses across Europe. His marriage to Mary of Teck had represented not just personal compatibility, but a deliberate attempt to normalize British royal genetics through a union that appeared to offer both genetic refreshment and the kind of practical partnership that might help the monarchy adapt to the democratic challenges of the 20th century. The genealogical mathematics of their relationship revealed the complex inheritance patterns that had shaped European royalty for generations. As George and Mary were second cousins once removed who shared Queen Victoria as a common ancestor, while also carrying bloodlines that had been concentrated through centuries of strategic breeding within the narrow circle of Protestant German nobility. George, born in 1865 as the second son of Edward VII, had never been intended for the throne until his elder brother Albert Victor's death in 1892 created a succession crisis that required rapid reorganization of both political arrangements and marriage plans that had been designed for a different heir with different genetic needs. Mary herself brought a unique combination of royal genetics and practical intelligence to their union, as her background included both legitimate descent from George III through her mother and the kind of morganatic connections that had been necessary to maintain genetic diversity within increasingly concentrated royal bloodlines. Her father, Francis, Duke of Teck, carried German noble ancestry that had been periodically refreshed through marriages outside the immediate circle of European royalty, while her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, represented one of the few remaining fertile branches of the Hanoverian royal tree that had not been completely depleted through generations of careful breeding. Their engagement in 1893, arranged hastily after Albert Victor's death, had left Mary without a royal fiancé and George without a suitable bride, appeared to offer solutions to both personal and political problems that had been created by the concentration of European royal genetics. Mary's previous engagement to George's elder brother had established her suitability for royal marriage, while demonstrating her ability to adapt to the complex protocols that governed British court life. Yet her transfer to the younger brother created unprecedented questions about the genetic and emotional implications of marrying someone who had been intended for another family member. The wedding ceremony at St. James's Palace in 1894, conducted with appropriate royal pageantry, yet constrained by the mourning protocols that still governed court behavior following Albert Victor's recent death, united two people whose personal compatibility would prove crucial in managing the challenges that 20th century monarchy would bring to the British royal family. Their genuine affection for each other while not rising to the level of romantic passion that had characterized some royal marriages, provided the emotional stability that would be necessary for navigating the political and social changes that would transform European civilization over the next 3 decades. George's personality reflected both the strengths and limitations of his royal inheritance, as he possessed the steady temperament and strong sense of duty that had characterized successful British monarchs, while also exhibiting the kind of rigid thinking and resistance to change that suggested genetic predispositions toward obsessive behavior patterns. His famous devotion to routine, which included wearing the same style of clothing for decades and maintaining daily schedules that varied little from year to year, demonstrated the kind of compulsive consistency that psychiatric historians recognize as common among individuals with certain inherited traits. Mary's approach to royal duties revealed the practical intelligence that had made her an ideal choice for modernizing British monarchy while maintaining its traditional legitimacy. Her interest in social welfare, art collecting, and the kind of public engagements that brought royalty into contact with ordinary citizens reflected both genuine personal inclinations and calculated efforts to adapt monarchical institutions to democratic expectations. Her correspondence, preserved in royal archives, documents a woman who understood intuitively that royal genetics alone could no longer justify political privilege in an era that demanded demonstrated competence and public service. Their reproductive relationship produced 6 children who survived infancy, an impressive record by royal standards that suggested their genetic combination had achieved better results than many European royal marriages of the era. Yet closer examination revealed subtle signs of the genetic stress that continued to affect British royal bloodlines despite apparent diversity, as several of their children exhibited health problems, learning difficulties, or personality traits that required careful management by court staff trained in dealing with royal genetic issues. Edward, their eldest son, and future King Edward VIII, demonstrated the complex inheritance patterns that characterized George and Mary's genetic legacy, as he possessed the intellectual capabilities and personal charm that made him effective in some royal roles, while also exhibiting the kind of impulsive decision-making and inability to accept advice that would ultimately make his abdication necessary. His personality development suggested genetic predispositions toward what modern psychology might recognize as attention deficit or addictive behavior patterns that made sustained focus on royal duties increasingly difficult as he matured. Albert, their second son who would rule as George VI, inherited both the speech impediment that would define his public image and the nervous temperament that made public appearances a source of genuine suffering throughout his life. His stammer, while partly attributable to psychological factors related to his unexpected succession following Edward's abdication, also reflected physical characteristics that may have resulted from the genetic concentration that continued to affect British royal bloodlines despite attempts at diversification through strategic marriage choices. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 tested both George's personal capabilities and the broader question of whether British royal genetics had produced a monarch capable of providing effective leadership during unprecedented national crisis. His decision to change the royal family name from SAXE-COBURG to Windsor in 1917, while politically motivated by anti-German sentiment, also symbolized the dynasty's recognition that genetic connections to German royalty had become political liabilities that required dramatic action to preserve monarchical legitimacy. George's management of the constitutional crisis created by the war's democratic pressures demonstrated both the advantages and limitations of his genetic inheritance, as his steady temperament and strong sense of duty provided stability during political upheaval, while his intellectual limitations and resistance to change sometimes created obstacles to necessary adaptations. His relationship with Prime Minister Lloyd George, documented in official records and private correspondence, revealed a monarch who understood his constitutional role yet struggled with the rapid social changes that were transforming British society. Mary's wartime activities, including hospital visits, charitable work, and the kind of public engagements that brought royalty into direct contact with ordinary citizens affected by military casualties and economic hardship, demonstrated how royal genetics could be channeled into socially useful activities that justified monarchical privilege through demonstrated service. Her ability to maintain royal dignity while adapting to unprecedented social conditions suggested that genetic concentration had not eliminated all capacity for practical adaptation among British royal family members. The post-war period brought new challenges that tested whether the genetic combination represented by George and Mary's marriage could produce heirs capable of leading British monarchy through the social and political changes that would characterize the 20th century. The rise of democratic movements, the decline of European monarchy, and the growing expectation that royal privilege must be justified through public service created pressures that traditional royal breeding programs had never anticipated. George V's death in 1936, following a reign of 25 years that had seen the monarchy successfully navigate World War I, the Irish independence crisis, and the beginning of imperial dissolution, marked the end of an era that had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of royal genetic adaptation. His marriage to Mary had produced heirs who would face unprecedented challenges in maintaining monarchical relevance, yet their genetic inheritance included both the capabilities and vulnerabilities that would determine whether British royalty could survive the transition to modern democratic society. The dental problems that plagued George V throughout his adult life, requiring increasingly complex medical interventions that were carefully concealed from public knowledge, provided visible evidence of the genetic factors that continued to affect British royal health despite apparent diversification of bloodlines. His death, officially attributed to respiratory failure but complicated by multiple health problems that may have reflected his concentrated genetic inheritance, demonstrated that even the most successful attempts to refresh royal genetics remained constrained by the limited diversity available within European noble bloodlines.